This is part 2 of Every First Lady of the U.S. If you haven't watched the first part yet, you must check it out. Now, let's continue where we left off last time. Ada McKinley, William McKinley. McKinley never wanted to be fragile. She was born with a backbone, educated, sharp, independent, but history and her own body had other plans. By the time her husband became president, Ida was practically an invalid, but also, somehow, the First Lady, America's most watched, most pitied, and most misunderstood woman. And if her life was a stage, then William McKinley was the man forever pulling the curtains gently closed. Ida was born in 1847 into a prominent Ohio banking family. She was well educated, studied literature, philosophy, and foreign languages, and took a job as a cashier at her father's bank. A rarity for women in the mid-19th century. She was stylish, quick-witted, far from shy, and when she met William McKinley, a rising lawyer and Civil War veteran, she saw something she could build a future with. They married in 1871. A good match. Loving, playful, full of potential. Then everything collapsed. In 1873, after the birth of their second daughter, Ida's mother died. Weeks later, her infant daughter died. Then, in 1876, her first daughter died too, at age 4. 3 deaths in 3 years. And something in Ida McKinley fractured. She developed debilitating epileptic seizures. Her health deteriorated. She withdrew from social life. Doctors had few answers. The diagnosis? Nervous invalidism. Translation: she's sick and we don't know what to do with her. But William McKinley never wavered. He built his political life around her needs, not in spite of them. When he became governor of Ohio, then president, in 1897, he took Ida with him, not as a symbol, but as a promise. He would not leave her behind, even if the world wanted him to. As First Lady, Ida rarely stood. At official receptions, she was seated in a velvet chair, usually slightly off to the side, with a lace handkerchief and a blank expression. If she had a seizure mid-event, staff would gently draw the curtains or usher guests away. William would calmly place a napkin over her face until it passed. Then she would return, silent, smiling faintly, as though nothing had happened. She was humiliated, quietly, regularly, and never publicly. The press didn't mock her, they pitied her, and McKinley shielded her from scandal by projecting a kind of devoted sainthood. He would hold her hand in public, sit beside her at state dinners, adjust his schedule around her condition. He once canceled a diplomatic dinner because she was having a bad spell. Another time, he stopped mid-speech when he noticed her trembling and stepped down to comfort her. It wasn't politics. It was a marriage at war with reality, and he was losing. In September 1901, the McKinleys traveled to Buffalo, New York for the Pan American Exposition. Ida was sick. The trip was risky, but William insisted, maybe out of duty or pride, or the hope that this one public outing might feel like old times. On September 6th, during a receiving line, McKinley was shot twice in the stomach by an anarchist posing as a well-wisher. He lingered for over a week, in agony, infection spreading, doctors guessing. Ida, fragile and grief-numbed, sat by his bedside. She whispered to him, stroked his hand, tried not to collapse in front of the staff. He died on September 14th. Her world, already shattered, finally went silent. Ida McKinley never recovered. She wore black, rarely spoke, refused public engagements. She moved back to Ohio and was cared for by her sister. She visited William's grave almost every day. She carried his photo in her locket. She barely ate. She barely smiled. She died in 1907, 6 years after him, as if her body had been running on borrowed breath, and once the debt came due, she handed it over without a word. Ida McKinley's story is not one of power. It's not even one of influence. It's a story about endurance, about a woman who wanted to lead and ended up surviving instead, about a president who bent the most powerful office in the world around the person he loved and paid for it with focus, reputation, and eventually his life. They said she was decorative, but only if you couldn't see the iron behind the lace. Edith Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, Edith Kermit. Carol Roosevelt didn't yell. She didn't grandstand. She didn't gallop up San Juan Hill. She left all that to her husband, a man whose very mustache seemed to shout. She, meanwhile, ran the house that ran the man who ran the empire. Edith wasn't just a first lady. She was the first modern first lady. She weaponized privacy, institutionalized decorum, and redesigned the White House, not just architecturally, but psychologically. Where her husband was wind and fire, she was polished stone, the calm that made his storm seem strategic. And she did it all while keeping her name, her ambition, and her influence out of the papers. Mostly, Edith and Theodore Roosevelt had known each other since childhood. She was friends with his younger sister, studied poetry and history, and lived just a few doors down. Their families vacationed together, wrote letters, spoke the same language of East Coast wealth and rigid expectation. They even dated briefly as teenagers, right? But it didn't last. Teddy went off to Harvard, fell in love with Alice Hathaway Lee, and married her instead. The heartbreak was polite. Edith moved on, until she didn't. In 1884, Alice Lee Roosevelt died suddenly, kidney failure masked as exhaustion, just 2 days after giving birth to their daughter. On the same night, in the same house, Theodore's mother also died of typhoid. He famously marked the day in his diary with a large black X and the words, "The light has gone out of my life." And then he vanished to the Badlands. Months later, back in New York, Edith re-entered the picture. They married in 1886, and she adopted his daughter, Alice, raising her alongside their own eventual 5 children. But Edith's role was never simply maternal. From the start, she was the editor, the buffer, the architect, shaping Theodore's career with a quiet ruthlessness that history tends to confuse for modesty. When Roosevelt became president in 1901, following the assassination of William McKinley, Edith entered the White House with a plan and a background in strategy. She immediately reorganized the domestic staff, imposed strict codes of behavior for guests and children alike, and reestablished the White House as a seat of formal power, not just a military annex. She commissioned the construction of the West Wing, not for vanity, but because she understood the presidency needed structural separation between public image and private life. For the first time, the executive offices were moved out of the family residence. This wasn't just renovation. It was philosophy in blueprint. Edith knew that what threatened her husband's image wasn't scandal. It was chaos. The press loved his wildness, but Washington hated unpredictability, so she cleaned the lens. She transformed the White House into a home, a fortress, a brand, and she made sure no one ever saw the seams. Edith Roosevelt gave very few interviews. She rarely made public speeches. She did not write op-eds or memoirs. She preferred influence over recognition and exercised it with surgical precision. She read every newspaper, watched the guest lists, blocked undesirable visitors, even quietly removed people from the social calendar if she deemed them political liabilities. She was, in essence, her husband's private secretary of sanity, and yet in public, she maintained an aura of graceful domesticity. The public saw a loving mother, a poised hostess, a woman whose greatest scandal was that she refused to allow dancing in the White House ballroom. Behind the scenes, she was negotiating architectural contracts, managing political appearances, and protecting her husband from his own worst instincts, mainly the one where he tried to fight metaphorical lions in every single press conference. The Roosevelts had 6 children, 5 together and 1 from Theodore's first marriage. Edith turned the first family into a living media campaign, wholesome, energetic, slightly chaotic, but never uncontrolled. The children's hijinks, sliding down banisters, bringing ponies inside, fighting mock battles on the lawn, were legendary, but they were also tactically permitted. Edith understood what Americans needed in the wake of Gilded Age corruption and McKinley's assassination: a leader who was human, a family that looked functional, a home that looked like yours but more disciplined. She offered them all 3, while keeping the door to the private quarters locked tight. Despite public appearances, the Roosevelt marriage was far from tranquil. Theodore's relationship with his eldest daughter, Alice Roosevelt, was a source of constant strain. Alice resented Edith, pushed boundaries, and stole headlines, once walking a pet snake into a White House reception. Edith held her ground, never fully accepted Alice, and quietly worked to minimize her presence. Theodore, torn between guilt and governance, sided inconsistently, but always leaned back on Edith for emotional and political stability. He knew who the general was behind the domestic front. and it wasn't him. When Roosevelt declined to seek re-election in 1908, Edith left the White House with relief, not regret, but politics followed them. In 1912, when Theodore split from the Republicans and ran under the Bull Moose Party, Edith vehemently opposed it. She saw it as a reckless vanity project, one that would divide the GOP and hand power to Democrats. She was right. He lost. Woodrow Wilson won, and Edith was vindicated, but also disgusted. After Theodore's death in 1919, Edith lived for nearly 3 more decades. Quietly, privately, always in control of his papers, his reputation, and the Roosevelt name. She declined to publicly feud with Eleanor Roosevelt, her niece-in-law and eventual successor in the East Wing, but she made her disdain obvious in letters. Where Edith believed in invisibility, Eleanor embraced visibility. Where Edith enforced privacy, Eleanor broadcast opinion. They were the bookends of the evolving First Lady role, and Edith made sure hers was remembered first. In ink, not flashbulbs. Edith Roosevelt was the First Lady who created the modern White House, physically and symbolically. She built walls, installed structure, imposed control. She didn't seek credit. She designed the spotlight, then refused to stand in it. She once wrote, "The woman's part is to influence, not to insist," and no one did that better than she did. But after Edith's controlled hush came something stranger, a woman who hated Washington, who hid in her room while her husband tried to end war, a First Lady who begged not to be one. Helen Taft, William Howard Taft, Helen Herron. Taft, known to her family as Nellie, didn't dream of being a princess. She dreamed of being powerful, and in the early 1900s, when women still didn't have the right to vote, she found the only real way to power available, marrying it. She wasn't passive, she wasn't ornamental, and she wasn't going to waste the White House on garden parties. Helen Taft was the First Lady to want the job before her husband did, and once she got it, she remade it into something closer to a political salon than a ceremonial stage. And she did it despite illness, resistance, and a deeply reluctant president who was happiest in his bathtub. Helen was born in 1861 in Cincinnati, Ohio, the daughter of a judge who ran in Republican political circles. As a teenager, she visited the White House during Rutherford B. Hayes' administration and met First Lady Lucy Hayes. It made an impression. Years later, Helen wrote in her diary, "If I ever marry, it will be a man with ambition, who has it in him to be president." Enter William Howard Taft. Big, kind, brilliant, no real interest in politics. Helen married him anyway, and then she dragged him to the presidency like a woman carrying a very large, very polite boulder up a hill. Make no mistake, Taft would never have become president without Helen. She managed his social calendar, advised his legal career, pushed him from judge to governor to secretary of war to presidential nominee. He didn't want it. She did, and she didn't pretend otherwise. She believed a Taft administration would be moderate, intellectual, above the mudslinging, and run effectively by her. When he finally won in 1908, Helen was already drafting plans for White House renovations, a musical series on the South Lawn, new social protocols, weekly public receptions, better wages for domestic staff, and a national capital worthy of global admiration. She wasn't there to decorate the East Room. She was there to redecorate the narrative of what a First Lady could do. Helen Taft took office ready to be active, modern, and visible. She was the First Lady to ride with her husband in the inaugural parade. A big deal at the time. She hosted open musical concerts on the White House grounds, inviting thousands of people to hear the Marine Band, often from working-class neighborhoods rarely welcomed onto the lawn. She removed stuffy Victorian furnishings and replaced them with a lighter neoclassical aesthetic. She invited black musicians and foreign diplomats into the White House, something not all DC society approved of. She also advised her husband on policy, corresponded with newspaper editors, and oversaw the planting of Washington's famous cherry blossom trees, imported from Japan. That's right. The cherry blossoms in DC exist because of Helen Taft. She personally reviewed the plans, approved the landscape changes, and attended the planting ceremony. It was diplomatic, it was visionary, it was iconic. And then it all nearly ended. Just a few months into her first ladyship, Helen suffered a major stroke in May 1909. She lost the ability to speak clearly. Her right side was partially paralyzed. She was out of the public eye for nearly a year. In that time, her husband, who'd always relied on her judgment, became hesitant, overworked, and politically adrift. Helen slowly recovered, relearned speech, resumed public duties, and, astonishingly, finished her term as First Lady, though never quite as actively as she'd begun. But even while physically diminished, she remained her husband's chief strategist and social barometer. And when his political career began to spiral, including a catastrophic break with his predecessor and former friend Theodore Roosevelt, Helen remained his fiercest defender. But she wasn't blind. She knew the presidency wasn't working, not for him, not for her ambitions, and she never forgave Roosevelt for what came next. In 1912, Taft lost re-election in a humiliating three-way race against Woodrow Wilson and Roosevelt, who ran third party and split the Republican vote. Helen was devastated, not just because of the loss, but because she believed they were better than the men who beat them. She retired with William to Yale, where he became a law professor, and eventually Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, his dream job all along. Helen returned to private life, bitter but composed. She published her memoir, Recollections of Full Years, in 1914, one of the earliest First Lady memoirs, full of opinion, policy, reflections, and zero patience for nonsense. She outlived her husband by nearly a decade, passed away in 1943, at age 81. She was buried beside him, the first First Lady interred at Arlington National Cemetery. Helen Taft was the most modern First Lady of the pre-suffrage era, and one of the least remembered. She brought political consciousness, institutional improvements, international diplomacy, cultural accessibility, and a clear desire to be more than ceremonial. She was ambitious in a time when that made people nervous. She was opinionated in a world that wanted her silent. She was influential without ever holding office, and even after her stroke and the setbacks that followed, she remained the intellectual scaffolding of the Taft presidency. Her true legacy, the cherry blossoms, the open concerts, the blueprint for First Lady as policy-adjacent executive. She once said, "I do not believe in the ornamental role of women." She proved that in full, with a silk glove on one hand and a pen, agenda, and staircase renovation blueprint in the other. Ellen Axon Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, Ellen Louise. Axon Wilson did not want to be First Lady, not because she disliked the public, not because she lacked the social skills, but because she knew herself too well. And what she knew was this: she was a painter, not a politician, a reader, a thinker, a Southern woman with a conscience. And when she married Woodrow Wilson, she signed up to build a family, not a nation. But nations don't ask for permission. They just hand you a staircase and tell you to wave from the top. So when her husband became the 28th President of the United States in 1913, Ellen walked up those stairs, poised, polished, already dying. Ellen Axon was born in Savannah, Georgia in 1860, in the shadow of the Civil War, to a Presbyterian minister father and an intellectually formidable mother. Her upbringing was steeped in Southern gentility, but also in melancholy. Her father died by suicide when she was 26, a trauma she rarely spoke of but never outran. She studied at the Art Students League of New York, where she was offered a scholarship to study in Paris, a dream that would have changed her life. Instead, she married a rising academic named Woodrow Wilson and entered the domestic sphere with the kind of controlled elegance reserved for women who knew how to fold napkins and swallow ambitions. She kept painting, she kept sketching, but she also had 3 daughters and a husband whose aspirations left very little room for anyone else's. By the time Woodrow Wilson reached the White House, Ellen had already been a political spouse for nearly a decade, first as First Lady of Princeton University, then as First Lady of New Jersey when Wilson became governor. She adapted with grace, but never quite enthusiasm. She preferred books over galas, conversations over speeches, ideas over rituals. Still, she was good at the rituals. That was the trap. She could do the role of First Lady. She just didn't want the role to do her. She knew Washington was a place that fed on women's image, but ignored their intellect. She knew her husband's moral compass didn't leave much room for disagreement, only footnotes. And yet, She tried to make the most of it. She approached the White House like a household to be improved, not a throne to sit on. And for a brief, shining moment, she became the first lady who did something few others had even thought to try. She brought progressivism inside the gates. Ellen Wilson was the first lady to turn her attention toward urban poverty, particularly the decaying alleyways and unsanitary slums of Washington, D.C. She visited them herself, walked among the tenements, took notes, asked questions, and then she did what most first ladies could only dream of. She lobbied Congress directly. She advocated for housing reform, called for public sanitation efforts, even convinced Woodrow to support legislation to clear and rebuild the city's worst slums. It passed. Quietly, efficiently, because it didn't come with fireworks or slogans. It came with Ellen's signature in ink and her voice in her husband's ear. She also expanded public access to the White House gardens, invited female journalists to informal gatherings, and supported racial uplift organizations, even as her husband's administration began resegregating federal offices behind closed doors. Her legacy would soon become a paradox. A progressive Southern woman married to a president who regressed on race behind her back. She tried to pull the country forward. He quietly tugged it the other way, and she didn't live long enough to fight him on it. From the beginning of her time in Washington, Ellen Wilson was not well. She suffered from fatigue, headaches, fainting spells. Her physicians called it nervous strain, the catch-all diagnosis given to women who were visibly dying but inconveniently important. In reality, she had Bright's disease, a form of chronic kidney failure that was, at the time, a death sentence. She hid it from the public, from most staff, even at first from her daughters, but she didn't hide it from her husband. Woodrow Wilson, a man often described as emotionally icy, was desperately in love with Ellen. Her illness left him shattered, frantic, tender in ways the public never saw. He began working shorter hours, visiting her more often, sitting by her bedside, reading from her favorite poets. He even wept in front of his aides. This wasn't just the First Lady's decline. It was the president's emotional unraveling, and it would soon become a national crisis. On August 6, 1914, just as World War I broke out in Europe, Ellen Wilson died in the White House. She was the third First Lady to die in the White House, and the first since Caroline Harrison 22 years earlier. She was 54. The East Room was draped in black. The funeral was private. Newspapers mourned her as gracious, dignified, and devoted. Her painting supplies were boxed away. Her reform efforts quietly stalled. Her name faded from the headlines. But her husband, he fell into a spiral of despair so profound that some advisors feared he would resign. For weeks, he barely worked. He wandered the residence in silence. He wrote obsessive, grieving letters. He had once said of Ellen, "She was the flower of my life and the light of my eyes." Now the White House was dark, and into that void would soon step another woman, younger, shrewder, and politically hungrier, who would help Wilson get back on his feet and never step out of the light again. But Ellen's ghost, she never left. Ellen Axon Wilson was a first lady caught between eras, ideologies, and illnesses. She brought modern reform into an antiquated role. She tried to blend gentility with advocacy. She painted softly against the storm that would soon engulf the world. She didn't shake up the system. She just tapped it on the shoulder and asked, politely but firmly, if it could do better. No. She died trying to make Washington look beyond its own reflection. And for a moment it did. Margaret Woodrow Wilson. She was the president's daughter, the firstborn, a gifted singer, a restless thinker, a woman trained to obey her father and defy herself. And for the space of 10 months, just long enough for a nation to forget its mourning, she became the acting First Lady of the United States. Her name was Margaret Woodrow Wilson, but her family called her Mag. She didn't wear the crown. She held it in place while the real queen lay buried, and the next waited in the wings. She was never meant to be First Lady, but death doesn't wait for elections. So she stood at the top of the stairs, smiled at the guests, and tried not to be swallowed by the silence her mother left behind. Margaret was born in 1886, the first child of Woodrow and Ellen Wilson, and from the beginning she carried the double burden of expectation and observation. Her father was a Princeton professor, then a university president, then a governor, then a president, and always a man for whom intellect was religion and affection was conditional. Margaret was bright, musically talented, and desperate to please him, but she wasn't what he wanted. Not exactly. She was bookish, but not brilliant, beautiful, but not docile, and worst of all, she had a mind of her own. She studied music, traveled, sang, flirted with opera, wrote poems, all under her father's long shadow. She loved her mother dearly, but she feared her father's judgment, and when Ellen Wilson died in 1914, it was Margaret who found herself suddenly, awkwardly, in charge of the most scrutinized house in America. Ellen's death left the White House shrouded in black. There were no state dinners, no public events, just an endless procession of condolences, and a president unraveling behind closed doors. Margaret stepped in, not because she wanted to, but because there was no one else. She took on the ceremonial duties, receiving guests, attending small diplomatic events, handling correspondence, managing the staff. She acted with decorum, care, and a kind of grieving politeness that became her entire aesthetic. She was 28 years old, unmarried, dutiful, invisible. And while the nation watched the president sink into depression, few realized his daughter was quietly keeping the machinery of public grace from falling apart. Margaret never smiled too much, never wore anything too bright, never drew attention to herself. She was a placeholder in pearls. And she knew it, because in the fall of 1914, a new woman arrived. Her name was Edith Bowling Galt, a widowed jewelry store owner from Washington society. She was clever, charismatic, confident, everything Margaret was taught not to be. Woodrow Wilson fell for her instantly. Within months, he was writing Edith love letters, taking long walks with her, smiling again. And Margaret, she was dismissed with a whisper, not publicly, not formally, but everyone knew what was coming. Her time as acting First Lady ended the moment her father decided he was ready to feel joy again. And that joy came with Edith's name on it. Margaret returned to the background with grace, but not without scars. She never married, never regained her father's full attention, and never quite forgave Washington for reminding her that, even at the very top, a woman's worth was temporary. After leaving the White House, Margaret drifted. She continued singing, even recording a few early tracks. She published poetry, gave public recitals, but something was off. Something had hardened. The reviews were polite. The applause was muted. Her career never took off. Her sisters, Jessie and Nellie, married and started families. Margaret didn't. Instead, in the 1930s, she moved to India. Yes, India. She joined an ashram run by the mystic Sri Aurobindo, where she became deeply involved in spiritual study. There she found a kind of peace that had always eluded her in the drawing rooms of Princeton and Washington. She eventually took a Sanskrit name, Nistha, meaning dedication. She lived in the ashram for over a decade, until her death in 1944, from an infection far from the marble tombs of American power. She was buried in India. Her death barely made the papers. Margaret Woodrow Wilson's time as First Lady was liminal, not quite official, not quite ceremonial, not quite acknowledged, but essential. She held the social structure of the White House together during its most emotionally unstable year. She absorbed the grief, smoothed over the silence, played the part that history didn't write down. She was, in many ways, the ghost between two wives, a daughter playing queen until her father could fall in love again, and for that she has been mostly forgotten. But without Margaret, there would have been no seamless transition, no recovered presidency, no continuity of grace. She was the woman who never got to matter aloud. But if you listen closely, in the footnotes, in the piano room, in the letterpress of forgotten programs, you can still hear her playing a piece she never finished. And when the music stopped, the wedding began. In walked the second Mrs. Wilson, not a daughter, not a ghost, but a woman who would speak for the president when he could no longer speak for himself. Edith Wilson, Woodrow Wilson. There's a reason people call Edith Bowling Galt Wilson the first female president, and it's not a compliment. Because what happened in the final 17 months of Woodrow Wilson's presidency was not an election, not a constitutional crisis, and not an admission. It was a cover-up. The president had a stroke, the First Lady took over, and the country simply played along. This is not just the story of a first lady. This is the story of a controlled political blackout, executed from a bedroom run with a silk-gloved iron fist and carried out by a woman the country barely knew until it was too late. Edith Bowling was born in 1872 in Wytheville, Virginia, into a once grand Southern family descended from Pocahontas, as she often reminded people. Her family had wealth, land, and expectations, all of which were burned out by the Civil War, leaving them with pride and very little else. Edith grew up in a faded house full of fragile heirlooms and stubborn ghosts. She wasn't given much formal education. Instead, her ailing grandmother taught her from a strange, rigid curriculum: history, etiquette, and how to manage enslaved people. Though slavery was long abolished by then, the message was clear: women rule quietly, but they rule. She married a jeweler, Norman Galt, and lived a life of quiet respectability in Washington, D.C. When he died in 1908, Edith, still in her 30s, wealthy, childless, and suddenly free, became a rare political widow, independent, elegant, and unattached. She traveled, bought cars, flirted with influence. She wasn't looking for a husband, but the President of the United States was looking for a reason to feel alive again, and she became it. When Ellen Wilson died in 1914, Woodrow Wilson fell into despair until he met Edith through mutual friends in the spring of 1915. He was smitten. Grieving, needy, she was calm, intelligent, beautiful, and not easily impressed. She made him chase her, for real. Refused his initial proposals. Took months to say yes. Rumors circulated that they had started courting before Ellen's death, and the tabloids nearly had a field day, until Wilson's staff pulled every lever to shut the scandal down. They married in December 1915, just 16 months after Ellen's funeral. The press called her Queen Edith. She didn't mind. She entered the White House not as a helper, but as a partner, and it wasn't long before her influence became the worst-kept secret in Washington. Edith Wilson didn't write policy, she didn't make speeches, but she understood the game. She edited her husband's letters, advised him on appointments, told him when to avoid guests, what phrases to drop from speeches, what alliances to watch. She wasn't loud, she was strategic. She cultivated a mystique, part Victorian grace, part modern elegance, never too bold, never too docile. And yet, when Wilson launched his crusade for the League of Nations, Edith was more than supportive. She was missionary zealous. She believed in it, believed he was chosen, believed her husband was the one man who could save the world from another war, which made what happened next all the more devastating and all the more tempting. On October 2nd, 1919, just after returning from a grueling national tour to promote the League of Nations, Woodrow Wilson collapsed in the White House with a massive cerebral thrombosis, a stroke. He lost most of his mobility on the left side, his vision blurred, his memory faltered, his ability to speak coherently gone. The doctors panicked. The aides froze. And Edith? She locked the door. Not metaphorically, literally. She physically restricted access to the president, from cabinet members, senators, and even the vice president, and insisted that she would handle all communication. She called it stewardship. Historians now call it something else, a secret, unconstitutional shadow presidency. For 17 months, the United States of America had a president who could barely speak, and a first lady who filtered, shaped, or outright replaced his decision-making. She received documents. She opened correspondence. She made notes in the margins. She decided what would and would not be shown to Wilson. She decided who got to speak with him. Sometimes she would respond in his name, dictating policy without his review. Cabinet officials were told he was tired. Reporters were told he was recovering. The American people were told nothing. The White House was turned into a fortress of polite lies, and Edith Wilson was the gatekeeper. To this day, there is no full record of what he actually signed, decided, or even understood during those final 500-plus days in office. What we do know is this. The Treaty of Versailles failed in the Senate. The League of Nations was abandoned by the U.S., and Woodrow Wilson never regained full cognitive function. But the presidency limped on, because Edith said it would. In 1921, Wilson's term ended. He was broken, pale. practically voiceless. Edith escorted him from the White House like a nurse, not a partner. They moved into a private residence in Washington. Edith remained by his side as caregiver, editor, and loyal gatekeeper until his death in 1924. She never apologized for what she did. She never admitted wrongdoing. In her memoir, she described her actions as necessary, patriotic, and faithful, framing herself as a devoted wife protecting a fragile man. It was revisionism soaked in perfume, because what she really did was run the country without a single vote cast in her name, and America let her. Because the alternative, admitting the presidency had been functionally vacant during a moment of global reckoning, was worse. So we closed our eyes and let Edith write the obituary. Edith Wilson lived for another nearly 4 decades after her husband's death. She died in 1961 on December 28th, Woodrow's birthday, at age 89, outliving most of her enemies, critics, and secrets. She was buried beside him. For decades, her role was minimized, romanticized, or ignored. Then came the biographies, the archives, the letters. Now she's recognized as the woman who pulled off the most successful unelected takeover of executive power in U.S. history, and did it in heels, pearls, and with impeccable manners. She wasn't a placeholder. She wasn't a nurse. She was a ruler in all but name. And no first lady before or since has ever come as close to becoming the presidency itself. But when Edith finally let go, the next first lady came in smiling. A piano teacher, a joke teller, a woman who just wanted to be left alone in the garden. Florence Harding, Warren G. Harding. Before there was Jackie, before there was Eleanor, before there was Michelle, there was Florence Kling Harding. And if you've never heard of her, that's by design. Because Florence didn't want fame. She wanted control. She was the first lady to read the newspapers before they were printed, the first to hire a press secretary, the first to strategize entire campaigns, and the first to know exactly how many skeletons fit in a walk-in White House closet. Her husband, Warren G. Harding, was charming, vague, and obedient. She was neither of the first two, and too smart to be the third. She was the real story of the Harding administration, and she left behind a trail of gossip, grief, and bodies so confusing that even history gave up trying to sort them. Florence was born in 1860 in Marion, Ohio, the daughter of Amos Kling, a wealthy, domineering man who owned half the town and thought he owned Florence too. She disagreed. At 19, she eloped with Henry DeWolf, a ne'er-do-well she soon discovered was more into drinking than parenting. They had a son, Marshall, but the marriage collapsed almost immediately. Florence left him and moved back in with her father, a social scandal at the time. But she didn't retreat. Instead, she reclaimed her reputation by becoming a music teacher, then a piano entrepreneur, running her own business, teaching elite students, managing finances. She became self-sufficient in a world that still treated women like unpaid furniture. And then came Warren, a small-town newspaper editor, ambitious, handsome, dangerously charismatic. She married him in 1891, and by all accounts, she made him. Florence Harding didn't just support her husband's political career, she designed it. When Warren entered state politics, it was Florence who wrote talking points, curated press coverage, and warned him who not to trust. She encouraged him to keep speeches short. She learned how to manipulate wire services. She knew when to whisper, when to nod, and when to threaten behind closed doors. She called herself the Duchess, and everyone around her nodded nervously. She also knew he was a womanizer. Affairs, multiple, mistresses, documented, a love child, almost certainly. Florence never pretended not to know, she just managed the fallout. Because she didn't marry for romance, she married for access. And when the Republican Party was casting around for a safe, likable candidate for the 1920 election, Florence made sure they landed on Warren. She handled the media. She managed logistics. She even handpicked campaign managers. Harding may have been the candidate, but Florence was the campaign. Warren Harding won by a landslide. It was the first presidential election in which women could vote, and Florence capitalized on it. She gave speeches to women's clubs, hosted suffragists, talked openly about her past, appeared at public events with a confidence no first lady had dared before. She was 61 years old, older than most first ladies, but she moved through Washington like she'd been waiting to run it her entire life. Florence oversaw the renovation of the White House kitchens, started a rooftop garden, and personally screened press credentials for reporters. She read every column, wrote letters in response to criticism, gave exclusive access to journalists she liked, and froze out those she didn't. She even pushed for progressive issues. Animal rights, she banned vivisection in D.C. Veteran care, she visited hospitals relentlessly. Prison reform, particularly for women. But the real story was what she knew and how tightly she kept it. The Harding administration was a festival of corruption. From the Veterans Bureau to the Justice Department, cronies looted the government like it was a speakeasy, and at the center of it all was the now infamous Teapot Dome scandal, the illegal leasing of federal oil reserves to private companies in exchange for bribes. Harding claimed ignorance. Florence claimed concern. She begged him to cut ties with shady allies, warned him about backdoor deals, and when that failed, she started leaking information behind the scenes to keep the press from smelling blood. But the rot was too deep. By 1923, rumors were circling that the administration was on the verge of collapse, and Florence's health was starting to fray under the strain. Then came the train. In the summer of 1923, the Hardings went on a voyage of understanding, a cross-country tour meant to reconnect with the American people and reset the narrative. Florence hated the idea, but she went because she knew something was very wrong. Warren Harding began experiencing chest pains, fatigue, strange episodes, and then in San Francisco, he died suddenly, in bed, with only Florence present. The official cause was a heart attack, but no autopsy was ever performed. Florence refused. She ordered an immediate embalming, a closed casket, and a swift train ride home. The rumors started instantly. Had she poisoned him? Was he about to be indicted? Was it a mercy killing? Or just the culmination of years of physical neglect? No answers, no investigation, just a widow with a velvet smile and a locked medicine cabinet. After Warren's death, Florence gave no interviews, wrote no tell-all, and burned most of their private correspondence. She kept quiet while the Harding administration imploded in scandal, watched his legacy disintegrate in real time, and never once tried to correct the record. She died just over a year later, in 1924. Heart failure, exhaustion, and perhaps the toll of holding up an empire made of paper. She was buried beside him in Marion, Ohio, in a tomb designed to be grand enough to hold the myth she helped build. Florence Harding was not a figure of sentiment. She was shrewd, controlling, hyper-aware, and decades ahead of her time in understanding media as power. She was the first truly modern political operator in the East Wing, and one of the only first ladies who understood damage control as a daily job. Did she cover up her husband's crimes? Probably. Did she run his presidency behind the scenes? Almost certainly. Did she poison him? We'll never know. But she outlived the lie long enough to make sure it stuck. And that, in the end, is what separates her from most first ladies before her. She wasn't trying to be adored. She was trying to win. And after the Duchess fell, in walked the small-town school teacher, modest, thoughtful, married to a president the nation forgot, but who knew exactly where his hat was at all times. Grace Coolidge, Calvin Coolidge. She was warm where he was cold, charming where he was silent, all brightness and color wrapped around a presidency that barely spoke above a whisper. Grace Coolidge didn't move history. She softened it. In the middle of the 1920s, a decade built on jazz, speed, and forgetting, she became a national favorite not by scandal or ambition, but by doing something first ladies before her rarely managed. She was beloved, and everyone knew it. Even her husband, especially her husband. Grace Anna Goodhue was born in 1879 in Burlington, Vermont. The daughter of a steamboat inspector and a mother who believed in three things: manners, music, and modesty. She was educated, gentle, and quick to laugh, especially at things no one else noticed. After college, she became a teacher for the deaf, working at the Clark School in Northampton, Massachusetts. It was there she saw, through an open boarding house window, a man shaving in his underwear. She burst out laughing. The man looked up, startled. His name was Calvin Coolidge. They married in 1905. They were opposites. She liked company. He liked quiet. She liked dancing. He once told her, Don't expect me to carry on conversations with you. And yet, she adored him. Not despite his silence, but perhaps because of it. He let her shine. She let him disappear. And for a man who hated small talk but loved certainty, that was all he needed. When Calvin rose through Massachusetts politics, Grace became his unintentional PR strategy. He was stiff. She was not. He was dry. She was delightful. She greeted constituents with a soft Vermont accent and a twinkle in her eye. She wasn't political, not exactly, but she understood performance. And when Calvin became vice president under Warren G. Harding, Grace moved to Washington, eager to explore the city's charm. That charm didn't last long. In August 1923, Harding died suddenly on tour. Calvin was sworn in by lamplight in his family's Vermont home. And Grace, she was in the next room, still in her housecoat. Everything changed, and nothing prepared her for it. As First Lady, Grace Coolidge refused to be grand. She brought quiet elegance to the East Wing, hosting garden parties instead of balls, inviting the deaf community to receptions, and posing for fashion spreads in vibrant dresses that made headlines even when she said nothing at all. She gave no speeches, published no memoir during her lifetime, but her image was everywhere. She became the First Lady to be photographed regularly by the new press corps, and she handled it with the grace of someone who had learned to smile for cameras before she knew what power felt like. Her bobbed haircut and bright outfits became the early symbols of the American flapper spirit. Even though she didn't drink, didn't smoke, and didn't dance much after Calvin told her he preferred silence. And America adored her for it. She was named America's Ideal Woman in 1924. She got more mail than Calvin. She got better press too. And she never once tried to leverage it for anything more than the occasional conservation cause. She was the face of the administration's humanity, which, as it turns out, was more needed than anyone realized. In 1924, the Coolidge's youngest son, Calvin Jr., developed a blister from playing tennis on the White House court. Without socks, the blister became infected. The infection became sepsis. He died within a week. He was 16. Grace collapsed. For months, she disappeared from public view. She grieved quietly behind drawn curtains. She resumed her duties, slowly, always with a brave face, but something inside her had fractured beyond repair. Calvin never recovered either. He wrote later, when he died, the power and the glory of the presidency went with him. Grace never spoke of it publicly, but friends said she often stared out of windows in silence, and yet she never allowed herself to become a tragic figure because the public didn't need tragedy, not yet. They needed red dresses and tulips and a smile that made the newsprint feel a little warmer. So she gave it to them every day without asking for anything in return. Grace Coolidge was many things. The First Lady to speak on radio, briefly, gently, and perfectly rehearsed. A supporter of the hearing-impaired community. A lover of baseball who regularly hosted teams at the White House. A devoted fan of pets, especially raccoons. One of which was a Thanksgiving gift she turned into a family mascot named Rebecca. She was funny too. When reporters asked what her husband liked to talk about, she replied, "You don't talk too much, do you, Mr. President?" He didn't answer. That was the joke. She made silence charming. She made stiffness feel safe. She didn't shake the nation. She soothed it. When Calvin Coolidge declined to run for another term in 1928, Grace packed their things with the same modesty she brought to the East Room. She returned to Northampton, lived quietly, wrote letters, attended funerals, smiled politely when guests came to ask what he was really like. She never remarried after Calvin's death in 1933. She never sought the spotlight again. She died in 1957 at the age of 78, a woman largely forgotten in the shuffle of louder first ladies with louder causes, but she left something behind. Not policies, not reforms, but balance. In a time when first ladies were expected to either decorate the presidency or disappear into it, Grace Coolidge learned how to do both, and somehow made the whole nation feel like they'd been personally invited to tea. But the next first lady didn't want tea. She wanted money, jewels, the good life, and she didn't care who saw her sparkle, as long as they looked away from what was happening under the table. Lou Hoover, Herbert Hoover. Lou Henry Hoover was a woman of firsts. The first woman to graduate with a geology degree from Stanford, the first lady to give a national radio address, the first to run the White House like a field camp, charting schedules, managing logistics, keeping people fed and moving. She was brilliant, traveled, fluent in multiple languages. And yet, when the country fell apart, no one cared about her resume. They saw the pearls, the ball gowns, the awkward refusal to admit what everyone outside the gate already knew. The party was over. Lou Henry was born in 1874 in Waterloo, Iowa, but raised on the western edge of America's imagination. In Whittier, California, a Quaker town filled with quiet rebellion and frontier optimism. She was a tomboy, an equestrian, a rock collector, a fencer, a girl who'd rather be elbow deep in dirt than laced into a parlor dress. At Stanford University, she met a shy young mining engineer named Herbert Hoover. He asked her to marry him before leaving for a job in Australia. She said yes, but on one condition. She'd go with him. And so began a global marriage that would span continents, careers, and at least a dozen simultaneous logistical problems. They lived in China, Burma, England, Russia, and Africa. Lou studied local customs, designed homes, managed their growing fortune, and in between it all, she co-translated a 16th century Latin mining manual, the kind of hobby that usually requires 2 graduate degrees and a coffee 4. She was cool-headed, calculating, and impossible to pin down. Even her smile looked like it might be holding back algebra. Herbert Hoover made his name not in politics, but in humanitarian engineering. During World War I, he coordinated massive food relief programs for Europe, feeding millions and becoming the quiet darling of post-war diplomacy. Lou was by his side the entire time, not just as a spouse, but as an executive collaborator. They were a team, but she preferred shadows to spotlights. She was perfectly comfortable coordinating relief efforts in 20 countries, as long as her name didn't end up on the marquee. When Hoover became Secretary of Commerce in the 1920s, Lou began taking a more formal place in Washington society. She hosted events, smoothed over tensions, spoke multiple languages at the table without blinking. She once sat across from a French diplomat and corrected his translation of a Roman agricultural term. Politely but decisively, Washington never quite figured her out. She was too poised to dismiss, too smart to box in, and too quietly powerful to ignore. So, when Hoover won the 1928 presidential election in a landslide, no one was surprised to see Lou float into the East Wing like she'd already been there for years. She just hadn't unpacked until now. When Lou Hoover entered the White House, America was glowing. The stock market was booming. Jazz was peaking. Confidence was selling by the pound. Lou embraced it with formality, style, and not a shred of apology. She hosted opulent receptions, redesigned the White House gardens, collected rare books and rare guests, wore sleek gowns and metallic silks, often with plunging backs and no visible effort to apologize for them. She didn't smile much, didn't charm, didn't entertain with folksy warmth. She simply glowed with correctness, which, as it turned out, was the worst possible optic for the disaster that was about to hit. In October 1929, the stock market collapsed. Within weeks, the banks started failing, factories shuttered, unemployment skyrocketed, and suddenly the image of the First Lady drinking champagne under crystal chandeliers felt like a sick joke. Lou Hoover didn't panic. She simply closed ranks. She doubled down on formality, cut off most press access, insisted that dignity could still be maintained, even as shantytowns were named Hoovervilles, and men stood in breadlines while the White House press office released menus from formal dinners. She refused to speak publicly about the Depression. She believed that acknowledging it would only deepen the despair, so she looked away and asked the country to do the same. Not everything she did was performative. Lou Hoover quietly advocated for racial equality, hosting black guests at White House events, including Jessie DePriest, wife of the first black congressman elected in the 20th century. The backlash was vicious. Southern politicians howled, newspapers frothed, anonymous letters poured in. Lou didn't flinch. She read them, filed them, refused to comment. She also delivered the first national radio address by a First Lady, a landmark moment, and used it to promote volunteerism, education, and civic discipline. Not empathy, not aid, discipline. Because Lou Hoover believed in order before rescue. To her, charity was a moral performance, not a structural solution, and that belief Noble in theory, disastrous in practice, helped cost her husband the presidency. By 1932, Hoover was the most hated man in America. Franklin D. Roosevelt's campaign painted him as out of touch, cold, and obsessed with abstractions while the nation starved. Lou? She stayed perfectly composed. She packed up the White House with military precision, spoke kindly of her staff, left no public commentary about the administration's collapse, but privately, she was furious. She never forgave the press, never forgave Roosevelt, never forgave the American people for refusing to understand that she and her husband had done everything right, and maybe they had, by a certain code. But codes don't feed children, and the nation had stopped being impressed with Latin translations. Lou Hoover spent the rest of her life working with the Girl Scouts, a cause she'd championed for decades. She remained involved in education, philanthropy, and the Hoover Institution, where she helped curate and shape her husband's legacy. She died in 1944, having lived long enough to see her husband's name partially redeemed by his later humanitarian work, but never her own. Her legacy is complicated, brilliant but blind, fierce but inaccessible, principled but out of step with a nation no longer interested in quiet excellence behind closed gates. She was a first lady who refused to bend, even when the country broke, and that's why she's remembered only in fragments, elegant, opaque, and covered in dust no one wants to clean. But after the crash came the roar of a new age. A first lady who refused to stay silent, a partner, a fighter, a voice, and a revolution in a blue dress. Eleanor Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt. If you were alive in the 1930s and you wanted to reach the President of the United States, you had two options. Go through the White House press office, write to Eleanor Roosevelt. And many did, thousands. Every month, letters from farmers, mothers, soldiers, orphans, convicts, children. They told her their stories. Stories no one else would listen to. And she read them. Because Eleanor Roosevelt wasn't just the first lady, she was the conscience of a nervous country. And for 12 long years, across the Great Depression and the bloodbath of World War II, she was the only member of the Roosevelt administration who made Americans feel like someone cared. Not just someone who posed, not someone who smiled, someone who listened, and then somehow spoke. Eleanor Roosevelt was born in 1884 into the cursed American aristocracy. Rich, famous, and emotionally broken. Her father was Theodore Roosevelt's younger brother, a charming alcoholic adored by Eleanor, but ultimately destroyed by addiction. Her mother, beautiful, cold, dismissive. She called Eleanor Granny because of her solemn face. By age 10, Eleanor was an orphan, tossed between relatives like an expensive problem. She was shy, serious, and already absorbing the message women like her were taught early. You're not here to take up space. You're here to manage it. So that's what she learned to do, until she didn't. In 1905, she married her fifth cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Handsome, ambitious, and confident in a way Eleanor never was. Their wedding was presided over by Uncle Teddy, then President of the United States. Eleanor gave birth to 6 children. Only 5 survived. She endured affairs, most notably Franklin's long romance with her own social secretary. She swallowed humiliation, and for a time, she nearly disappeared, until polio struck Franklin in 1921, and suddenly everything changed. Franklin couldn't walk. Eleanor learned how to run. She became his political surrogate. His eyes, ears, and sometimes spine. She entered unions, classrooms, tenements, relief centers, spoke to people who hadn't been heard in decades. She discovered she had a voice. And worse, she discovered people listened, and she wasn't about to give it back. When FDR was elected president in 1932, Eleanor was already on fire. The country was crumbling. Unemployment was in the millions. Families were starving. Banks were folding like paper hotels. And here came a first lady who refused to stay in the parlor. She gave speeches, held press conferences, published a daily syndicated column, My Day, which ran 6 days a week for 27 years. She traveled the country alone, inspecting relief programs, holding town halls, visiting coal mines and native reservation, and writing blistering reports about what she saw. She wasn't her husband's echo. She was his warning light. Sometimes he listened, sometimes he didn't, but she never stopped pushing. Eleanor's relationship with the press was revolutionary. She insisted on hosting press briefings exclusively for women reporters, because at the time, major newspapers refused to send women to White House events unless it was required. So she made it required. She gave them access, gave them copy, gave them careers. It was a quiet revolution, fought not with slogans but with press passes and coffee. She understood that power didn't always live in policy. Sometimes it lived in who got to hold the microphone. And she made damn sure women were at the table. Eleanor Roosevelt's most radical act was simple. She refused to look away. From the lynching photographs, from segregated schools, from the unpaid sharecroppers, from the lies white America told itself, she invited black guests to the White House, including Marian Anderson, after the Daughters of the American Revolution denied the opera singer access to Constitution Hall. She resigned from the DAR in protest, and then helped arrange for Anderson to sing at the Lincoln Memorial, a performance witnessed by 75,000 people. She supported anti-lynching legislation, Jewish refugee aid, interracial labor unions, and anti-fascist causes, all while facing mountains of hate mail. Southern politicians called her that no bojao or loving woman. She kept going. When her car was shot at during a trip to Tennessee, she smiled and said, "I suppose I'm just too visible." Visible? Yes, but never sorry. As America entered World War II, Eleanor's power grew. She visited wounded soldiers, organized civilian relief, supported women in defense industries, and quietly advocated for Japanese Americans being sent to internment camps. One of the few moral failures she would later acknowledge with sorrow. She knew the war was reshaping the world, and she wanted women to be part of that world not as decorations, but as citizens. She pushed Franklin to create the Fair Employment Practices Committee. She fought for equal pay for women workers. She made first aid kits by hand. She also made policy memos. She was everywhere, and yet, Franklin never allowed her near foreign diplomacy. He knew she was powerful, but diplomacy, he believed, was a man's game. Until it wasn't. In April 1945, FDR died in Warm Springs, Georgia. Eleanor was not there. He died with his mistress, Lucy Mercer, by his side. Eleanor was told by telegram, and in that moment, humiliated, exhausted, heartbroken, she had every right to fade. Instead, she rose. She said, "The story's over." She was wrong. It was just beginning. President Truman called her the First Lady of the World. He appointed her to the first U.S. delegation to the United Nations. There, she chaired the committee that drafted and adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. It was her finest hour, and the crowning achievement of a woman who had once been told not to speak too loudly at dinner. Eleanor Roosevelt wasn't an accessory. She wasn't a hostess. She wasn't a first lady. She was a movement in pearls. She taught America that a woman in the White House could be political, could be loud, could be moral, could be flawed, could be real. She didn't fix everything. She made it harder to ignore what was broken. She died in 1962, a national icon, a target, a saint, and still, somehow, a scandal to the people who never forgave her for giving a damn out loud. And when she left the stage, the country tried to put the lid back on. It was time that they said for quiet again, time for post-war dinner parties, and a first lady who wouldn't make waves, except perhaps in pearls. Bess Truman, Harry S. Truman, Elizabeth Virginia Wallace Truman, known to everyone as Bess, was probably the most reluctant first lady in American history. She hated reporters, she despised publicity, she refused to give interviews, and she often made Eleanor Roosevelt look like a Vegas showgirl by comparison. Where Eleanor was public reform, Bess was private retreat. Where Eleanor built a legacy out of speeches and causes, Bess built walls and locked them and labeled the keys, "None of your business." She was fiercely private, deeply loyal, and the kind of woman who could sit through a state dinner without blinking, then tear down your entire argument with a single sigh. She didn't want to be remembered. She wanted to be left alone. And for nearly 8 years, America just stared at the curtain. Bess Truman was born in 1885 in Independence, Missouri, to a wealthy and well-connected family. Her father was a grain dealer, her mother a Southern belle with opinions and the wardrobe to match. Bess was smart, athletic, and charming. but also raised to believe that ladies do not advertise their feelings. She was class president. She played tennis. And crucially, she lived across the street from a shy, bespectacled boy named Harry S. Truman. Harry fell in love with her when they were both teenagers. She didn't, not at first. He courted her for years. She declined. He persisted. Eventually, she said yes. They married in 1919 after Harry returned from World War I. She was 34. She told friends she wasn't interested in marrying a politician. She wanted a man who'd be home for dinner. Spoiler, she did not get that man. When Franklin D. Roosevelt died suddenly in 1945, Harry Truman, then vice president for only 82 days, was sworn in as president. Bess was furious. She had begged Harry not to go to Washington in the first place. Now he was the leader of the free world. She packed her bags, moved to the White House, and immediately tried to pretend none of it was happening. Unlike Eleanor Roosevelt, who made the first ladyship a visible political platform, Bess Truman treated it like a punishment with excellent upholstery. She attended official events, smiled when absolutely necessary, and took refuge in long walks, crossword puzzles, and unbroken silences. Her idea of a press conference was a typed Q&A with answers like, "No, I don't recall, and that's personal." She held exactly one formal press conference in 8 years. It lasted 15 minutes. She said nothing new. The press called her the Phantom First Lady. She didn't care. She had zero interest in being loved, only in being invisible. That's not to say Bess Truman was passive. In private, she was Harry's confidant, his sounding board, his editor. He trusted no one more. Not his aides, not his generals, only Bess. He once said, "She was the boss. I just held the title." She reviewed his speeches, helped craft responses, told him bluntly when he was being a damn fool. When the decision came to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, it was Bess who urged Harry to trust his judgment and not let the scientists or military men push him into hesitation. And when Truman fired General Douglas MacArthur during the Korean War, a move that nearly detonated his presidency, Bess didn't flinch. She supported him, silently, fiercely. She didn't need to make headlines. She was the firewall, and she knew it. Bess Truman's only public vulnerability was her daughter, Margaret, an aspiring opera singer who often received brutal reviews from critics. In 1950, a Washington Post reviewer wrote that Margaret could not sing very well. Harry Truman wrote back, "Someday I hope to meet you. When that happens, you'll need a new nose and a supporter below." Bess said nothing. She didn't need to. The message was clear. Attack her, she'll ignore you. Attack her family, and she will let her husband bury you alive. Behind that pleasant Midwestern reserve was a steel spine and a loaded shotgun. Bess Truman left no memoir, donated no wardrobe, hosted no conferences. She destroyed most of her private correspondence. And when asked how she wanted to be remembered, she simply replied, "As myself." She returned to Independence, Missouri when Harry left office in 1953. She sat on the porch, wrote letters, gardened, watched TV, ignored interviews, and lived to be 97 years old, the longest living First Lady in American history at the time of her death in 1982. Eleanor had rewritten the role. Bess quietly set it back on fire, locked the door, and buried the key under a rose bush. She was not warm, she was not progressive, she was not interested in branding herself, and that somehow made her all the more unforgettable. Because in an age of television, charisma, and the growing cult of personality, Bess Truman proved something radical. Silence is still a form of power, but silence wouldn't last. Next came a woman who had practiced for First Lady like it was a career. She wore gloves, smiled for cameras, and made America feel elegant again. And her husband? He brought the camera crew. Mamie Eisenhower, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Mamie Geneva Dowd. Eisenhower was not a revolutionary. She didn't make speeches, she didn't crusade for causes, she didn't write a manifesto, but she did something subtler and perhaps stranger. She turned the role of First Lady into a kind of national sedative, a sugary, smiled performance of prosperity, order, and charm in a decade crackling with nuclear anxiety and racial unrest. She was everything Americans thought they wanted in a leader's wife. Polished, cheerful, efficient, and gloriously, gloriously pink. But behind that pastel persona was a woman who had already survived war, loss, and invisibility. Mamie didn't change the world. She outlasted it. Mamie was born in 1896 in Boone, Iowa, but raised in Denver, where her father, a meat-packing millionaire, provided a lifestyle that included servants, parties, and all the trappings of genteel American leisure. She attended finishing schools, had her own butler by age 10, and knew how to set a formal table before she could vote. She wasn't trained for politics, she was trained for presentation. But then she met a young West Point graduate named Dwight David Eisenhower. He had no money, no pedigree, and no interest in Denver's social scene. Mamie married him anyway on Valentine's Day, 1916, and so began her real education. It came with no textbooks, only military assignments, mud, and the grief of watching the 20th century chew through everything she thought she'd counted on. In their first 37 years of marriage, Mamie and Ike moved more than 30 times. They lived in Panama, the Philippines, Paris, and the American South. They endured cramped barracks, makeshift kitchens, and stretches of cold silence while Ike climbed the ranks. She managed staff, sorted logistics, hosted generals, kept house on nothing, packed and unpacked a life that was never still. She raised their only child, John, almost entirely alone, and then came the worst moment of her life. In 1921, their first son, Dowd Dwight, nicknamed Icky, died of scarlet fever at age 3. Mamie never fully recovered. She carried the grief in private and never spoke of it publicly. She smiled anyway. She always smiled, even when her heart was still a battlefield. When World War II broke out, Dwight Eisenhower was promoted to Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. Mamie stayed in Washington, writing letters, keeping appearances, and holding together the image of a calm, supportive homefront wife. She was flooded with attention, some of it jealous, some of it cruel. Rumors swirled about Ike's close working relationship with Kay Summersby, a British officer who served as his driver and aide. Some suggested it was more than professional. Mamie never responded to the speculation, not once. She simply kept writing him letters. Long, warm, detailed. When the war ended, Eisenhower returned to a hero's welcome. And Mamie, loyal, elegant, and blank-faced, stood by his side like a symbol no one could quite interpret. When Ike was elected president in 1952, Mamie stepped into a White House still holding the smoke of war and the ashes of Eleanor Roosevelt's moral dynamism. She brought in new drapes, new gowns, and a new era. She reintroduced formal dinners, reestablished strict etiquette, oversaw staff with a firm, Midwestern touch, insisted on wearing gloves at all times in public, even while shaking hands with children. She also made pink a national aesthetic. Mamie Pink, a soft, candy-colored hue, showed up everywhere. Dresses, napkins, furniture, White House bathrooms. It became the color of the 1950s housewife ideal. What Americans didn't see was that the woman behind it had lived in military camps and buried a son. She wasn't selling pink, she was hiding in it. Mamie Eisenhower was no fool. She understood how power worked, and she understood how women in power were expected to behave. So she gave the public everything it wanted. Syrupy charm, hostess perfection, the right hat for every occasion, but behind the scenes, she was meticulous. She was known to keep detailed schedules for White House staff, down to exact timing for cocktail trays. She could recite names, ranks, and seating charts with precision. She made sure staff understood how the table should be set, which guests could be near the president, and which ones could not. She didn't meddle in policy. She didn't want to, but she made sure that what happened inside the White House never looked chaotic, no matter how chaotic the Cold War became outside of it. And that was her real genius. She made normalcy look effortless, even as the world edged toward annihilation. Mamie wasn't universally loved. Critics said she was out of touch, that she represented a Stepford ideal at odds with a changing America, that she didn't care about civil rights, that she smiled too much, but she was also the first lady to be embraced by television. Her holiday specials were charming. Her fashion sense was copied. She was relatable in a decade that wanted its first lady quiet, lovely, and non-threatening. She gave them all three, and kept her opinions to herself. Almost. She was known to privately influence appointments, including personnel selections for military spouses and social events. She once reportedly advised Ike on whether to fire a cabinet official, not based on policy, but on decorum. She didn't make the big moves. She made sure they didn't look messy. And sometimes that's the more difficult job. When Ike left office in 1961, Mamie packed the pink up, returned to Gettysburg, and resumed the life of a retired general's wife, planting flowers, writing thank you notes, and refusing to dish gossip about Washington. She remained a staunch Republican, disliked the counterculture of the 1960s, and recoiled from the emerging women's liberation movement. She had built her role on dignified invisibility. The idea of women demanding power openly, not her brand. Still, she remained a figure of affection and nostalgia for many Americans. When she died in 1979 at age 82, tributes called her the nation's hostess, the essence of 1950s grace, and the last truly non-political First Lady. But she was more than that. She was the camouflage of comfort in an era that feared everything: communism, rock and roll, nuclear fallout, and needed at least one thing to stay perfectly, endlessly composed. That thing was Mamie. But the 1960s weren't interested in pink anymore. The next First Lady wore tailored suits, spoke multiple languages, and knew exactly how to light a cigarette in a crisis. She wouldn't host the party. She would choreograph it. Jacqueline Kennedy, John F. Kennedy. She was 31 years old when she became First Lady. Too young, too elegant, too fluent, too quiet. Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy was not what America was used to, and that's why the country obsessed over her, and why the country never truly understood her. She didn't want the job. She didn't even vote for her husband in the primary. But once he won, once the cameras turned, once the public started peering through the keyholes, Jackie turned the First Ladyship into a gallery of illusions, and herself into the exhibit America couldn't stop staring at. And then, in 1 second, on one afternoon in Dallas, she shattered into myth. Jackie was born in 1929, just weeks before the stock market crash. Her father, Blackjack Bouvier, was a Wall Street socialite with charm, money, and no breaks. Her mother, Janet, was razor sharp, controlling, and obsessed with appearances. They divorced when Jackie was young, a social scandal among the elite, and her childhood became a revolving door of stepfathers, boarding schools, and perfect posture. She read voraciously, studied at Vassar, then the Sorbonne, then George Washington University. She became a reporter, briefly, and earned a reputation as the inquiring camera girl at the Washington Times-Herald. She was already fluent in French, already fascinating to watch, already an introvert disguised as a debutante. Then she met Jack. John F. Kennedy was 12 years older. A war hero, Harvard royalty, political dynamite. They married in 1953 when Jackie was 24. She instantly became a national curiosity, gorgeous, reserved, vaguely European in her detachment. She gave birth to a stillborn daughter, then a son, John Jr., then lost another, a baby named Patrick, who died just 2 days after birth. The grief was real, but Jackie never let the world see the full weight of it. She learned early and fast that the only power she had was in controlling the frame, and she became a master of framing. When JFK was elected in 1960, Jackie entered the White House pregnant, exhausted and publicly reluctant. She hated campaigning, hated politics, hated being treated like a hat rack with pearls. So she did something no First Lady had ever done. She turned the White House into a museum. Literally. She launched a massive restoration project, collecting authentic period furniture, art, and objects from past administrations. She hired historians, archivists, curators. She turned the executive mansion into an emotional symbol of American history, and herself into its curator. And in 1962, she hosted a televised tour of the White House that was watched by 56 million people. She spoke in soft, measured tones, wore a slim dress, carried herself like a docent in Versailles, and America fell in love. The tour won an Emmy Award. Jackie became a sensation. She had taken the cold, gilded formality of the presidency and given it cultural heat, and she did it without ever raising her voice. Jackie Kennedy knew how to dress a message. Her Chanel suits, pillbox hats, and white gloves became instant shorthand for sophistication, but they were also strategically chosen armor. When she visited India, she wore pastels that matched the marble palaces. In France, she out-Frenched the French. In Washington, she dressed like a national flag in silk. She spoke 4 languages, knew world leaders by their favorite poets, and charmed heads of state by saying very little, very well. Her silences were legendary, calculated, weaponized. JFK once said, "I am the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris." It wasn't a joke. It was the truth. And in the Cold War image game, Jackie was America's most effective propaganda. Behind the gowns, Jackie was often lonely, brittle, and tightly controlled. She hated press intrusion, resented political wives, feared for her children's safety, and lived in quiet terror of her husband's serial infidelities, most notoriously his long-running affair with Marilyn Monroe. Jackie's response? Distance, elegance, a fortress made of tact. She retreated into books, rode horses at midnight, took long guarded vacations. She wasn't passive. She was just outnumbered by the myth she'd helped build, until it all broke. Dallas, the motorcade, the convertible, the pink suit, the gunshots. Jackie's most iconic image isn't a smile. It's the splatter of her husband's blood on her Chanel jacket. She refused to change clothes for the swearing in of Lyndon Johnson. "I want them to see what they've done," she said, and they did. The grief was national. But Jackie's grief became global stagecraft. She arranged JFK's funeral to mirror Abraham Lincoln's, complete with black horses and riderless stirrups. She walked beside the casket in a veil and heels, holding her children's hands like a statue carved out of human pain. And the world watched, not because she asked them to, but because she had trained them to. Days after JFK's death, Jackie invited journalist Theodore White to her private quarters. She gave him a phrase, "Don't let it be forgot that once there was a spot for one brief shining moment." That was Camelot. She compared her husband's presidency to the musical, a doomed kingdom of idealism and courage. She said, "There will be great presidents again, but there will never be another Camelot." And just like that, the brand was born. The Kennedy administration was frozen in time, youthful, tragic, golden, and Jackie sealed it with a quote. No other First Lady has ever written the script for her husband's legacy so effectively. It was a lie, but it worked. After JFK, Jackie retreated from public life. She married Aristotle Onassis, a Greek shipping tycoon, in 1968, a scandal that stunned Americans who wanted her to remain a grieving marble widow forever. She didn't. She took the money, took the yacht, took the autonomy, and when Onassis died, she returned to New York and became a book editor, quietly championing art, poetry, and literature until her death in 1994. She never ran for office, never gave long interviews, never broke character. She remained the most enigmatic First Lady in American history, and she liked it that way. Jackie Kennedy was not warm, not loud, not always kind. She was strategic, bruised, brilliant, and surrounded by illusion. But she understood one truth better than anyone. America doesn't need accuracy. It needs iconography. And she gave it that. Perfectly dressed, perfectly posed, perfectly tragic. She wasn't just a First Lady. She was an idea. And no one, before or since, has ever worn it better. But after the elegance came Texas steel. The next First Lady wore big hair, big hats, and a bigger voice. She didn't curate the presidency. She bulldozed it into bloom. Lady Bird Johnson, Lyndon B. Johnson. Lady Bird Johnson was underestimated from day one. She was soft-spoken, demure, polite to the point of invisibility. She wore floral prints, sign notes, bird, and never raised her voice above the pitch of a polite suggestion, which made it easy for people to miss that she was also one of the most strategically influential First Ladies in U.S. history. She took over her husband's office when he went to war. She ran a media empire before she ran a household. She understood public relations, federal budgeting, and rural infrastructure better than most senators. And while America reeled from assassinations, war protests, and civil unrest, Lady Bird was planning beauty with one hand and holding the White House together with the other, not to distract, but to preserve what little was left to believe in. Born in 1912 in Karnak, Texas, Claudia Alta Taylor got the nickname Lady Bird from a nurse who said she was pretty as a ladybird. It stuck forever. She grew up wealthy but motherless. Her mother died when she was just 5. She wandered East Texas with books in her hand and questions in her mind. Studious, lonely, watching. She attended the University of Texas, studied journalism and history, and graduated summa cum laude. She was brilliant, but quietly so. She didn't want the stage. She wanted the wires behind the curtain. Then she met Lyndon Baines Johnson, a tidal wave of ambition wrapped in a 6-foot-tall Texas drawl. He proposed on their first date. She said yes 10 weeks later, and never stopped saying yes. Even when it nearly killed her, LBJ's political career was a machine, and Lady Bird was one of its first engineers. In 1941, when Lyndon went to fight in World War II, Lady Bird ran his congressional office herself. She didn't just keep it warm, she improved it. Writing speeches, hiring staff, editing correspondence. She also invested her own inheritance, $10,000, into buying a failing radio station in Austin. It was the smartest gamble of her life. She turned it around in less than 2 years. By the 1950s, it was a broadcasting empire with multiple media holdings, all under her control. She made millions. Legally, strategically, quietly, she paid for many of LBJ's early campaigns. She knew every county in Texas by name. And she did it all while smiling like a PTA president. Lady Bird wasn't a political wife. She was the campaign's CFO. Then came the moment that ripped the century in half. Dallas. A motorcade, a rifle, a president shot, and suddenly Lyndon Johnson, vice president, power broker, Southern moderate, was president of the United States. Jackie Kennedy stood beside him on Air Force One in a bloodstained suit. Lady Bird stood just behind her, already taking mental notes. No first lady had ever inherited the role like this, not through death, not like this. Jackie left a world of velvet tapestries and tragedy. Lady Bird walked into chaos, suspicion, and a country looking for glue, so she got to work. Lady Bird Johnson launched the most ambitious environmental initiative of any First Lady before or since, the Highway Beautification Act of 1965. But it wasn't just about flowers. It was about optics. She understood that Americans were losing faith in everything, and that something as simple as wildflowers by the roadside could soothe a fraying national identity. She championed tree planting, billboard removal, junkyard screening, urban parks, nature preservation. Her slogan, "Where flowers bloom, so does hope." Critics called it fluff. She called it psychological infrastructure, and she won. Congress passed the Beautification Act with bipartisan support. It remains one of the most visible and enduring legacies of the Johnson administration. But while she was planting flowers, she was also managing a war. Lady Bird supported the Vietnam War. Publicly, if not joyfully, she stood beside Lyndon during protests, endured heckling, sat through campus events where students screamed at her, watched the country turn on her husband, from civil rights conservatives on the right to anti-war youth on the left. She didn't flinch. In fact, she became his emotional firewall. She was the only person who could talk him down from his manic rages, the only one who could say no and get away with it, the only one he trusted to tell him if he was being Lyndon again, charming in one room, cursing in the next. He relied on her. Not to be Jackie, not to be Mamie, but to be a functional, stabilizing force in a house that never stopped bleeding. Lady Bird Johnson supported the Civil Rights Act of 1964. She knew it would cost them votes in the South. She didn't care. She traveled through Dixie on what was called the Lady Bird Special, a whistle-stop train tour to promote civil rights and racial harmony. She gave 47 speeches in 5 days, often to hostile crowds, telling them politely, firmly, and with perfect grammar that segregation was finished, and they listened. Not because they agreed, but because they couldn't dismiss her. She had an accent they trusted, a posture they respected, and she made change feel gentle even when it was revolutionary. That was her superpower. When LBJ shocked the nation by announcing he would not seek re-election in 1968, Lady Bird said nothing, but she was relieved. She had held the center of a whirlwind for over 5 years, and now she could finally go back to the trees, the birds, and the quiet she'd sacrificed for too long. She returned to Texas, built the LBJ Ranch into a retreat, oversaw the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, one of the most important ecological institutions in the country. She outlived her husband by 34 years. She lived long enough to see environmentalism mainstreamed, civil rights legislated, and her legacy rewritten with flowers. She died in 2007 at the age of 94, and still, most Americans remember her only vaguely, which is a shame because Lady Bird didn't just beautify the country. She bandaged it with native blooms, with unglamorous, necessary work, and with a voice that never shouted, but somehow still made the world listen. But the next First Lady didn't whisper. She smoked. She drank. She rolled her eyes, and when she walked into the White House, she brought Watergate with her. Pat Nixon, Richard Nixon. If Bess Truman was the invisible First Lady, and Jacqueline Kennedy the idolized one, Pat Nixon was the expendable one. She was loyal, efficient, camera-ready, and absolutely not allowed to have an opinion. She married one of the most paranoid men in American history, stood by him through 2 failed campaigns, 4 elections, a presidency, a war, and a resignation, and somehow still managed to be called cold. Because Pat Nixon didn't cry on cue. She didn't flinch when people booed. She just did the job. And when the country came undone, not with a bang, but with microphones taped under desks, she did what she always did. She smiled anyway. The woman born Thelma Catherine Ryan in 1912 was called Pat by her father, a nod to her St. Patrick's Day birthday. But her childhood was less luck, more grit. She grew up on a dirt farm in California, working in the fields before and after school. Her mother died when she was 12. Her father died when she was 17. By the time she entered college, she was an orphan supporting herself as a typist, teacher, and movie extra. She majored in merchandising and drama, graduated cum laude, and turned down safer futures to live life on her own terms. And then, in 1938, she met a law student named Richard Nixon, who told her on their first date, "You're going to marry me." She laughed. Then she did. And from that moment on, Pat Nixon stopped, getting to choose what her life looked like. She campaigned for Nixon in every race he ever ran. Congress, Senate, Vice President, President. She gave speeches, rode trains, shook hands, smiled through jet lag and stomach bugs, and once a rock thrown at her head in South America. She went on solo goodwill tours of Asia, Africa, and South America as Second Lady, making her the most traveled First Lady in waiting in history. She took notes, studied cultural protocols, spoke to women, not just dignitaries. She was charming in a way that made diplomats forget she was married to the most strategically rigid man in the building. But she never tried to eclipse him. She knew better. When Nixon lost the California governor's race in 1962 and told the press, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore," Pat just stood behind him, tight-lipped. She had already packed the car. When Nixon finally won the presidency in 1968, Pat Nixon was 56, older than most First Ladies and significantly more experienced. She entered the White House already tired, but she hit the ground running anyway. She became the first Lady to publicly support women working outside the home, the first to wear pants in public, the first to visit all 50 states while her husband was in office. She oversaw the restoration of hundreds of White House artifacts, opened more public rooms to tourists, and fought to make the White House accessible to people with disabilities. She refused to hire a press secretary and avoided talking about herself unless absolutely cornered. But when she spoke, it was sharp and careful and unmistakably her. She once said, "I don't know how a woman can work full-time and be a good mother." The press crucified her. They wanted a stance. She gave them a sigh. Because Pat Nixon didn't want to be a symbol. She wanted to be useful. And she was. Until the scandal came and made her mute by design. Watergate began as a break-in, then a cover-up, then a crater. By 1973, the scandal was metastasizing into televised hearings, criminal charges, and whispers of impeachment. And through it all, Pat Nixon stood by her husband, sometimes literally feet behind him, on stages where the air itself seemed to buckle under tension. She hated Watergate. She thought it was beneath them. She believed he had done nothing criminal, only too loyal to bad people. She begged him not to resign. And when he did, in August 1974, she refused to attend the resignation speech. She watched from another room, flanked by staff. Her face didn't move. And then she got on the plane, left Washington, and never spoke of it again. After the White House, Pat Nixon became a ghost in designer suits. She gave no interviews, published no memoir, issued no public statements on Watergate, Vietnam, or any of the policy battles she'd quietly watched unfold from behind the flowers at the table. She lived quietly in New Jersey, later in New York, eventually in California. She supported Nixon through his slow return to public life, smiled at dedications, clapped politely, but her own health began to fail. By the late 1980s, she had suffered multiple strokes. She died in 1993 at the age of 81. Her funeral was small, her name smaller. Even in death, she refused to become the center of the room. Pat Nixon has no statue, no wing named after her, no signature initiative. What she left behind is harder to frame. She was the first lady who did everything asked of her and was still called cold, the one who stood silently beside the worst presidential collapse in U.S. history and never once tried to rewrite her part. She was the background, on purpose, but in that background, she still traveled farther than any first lady before her, advocated for disabled access in public buildings, promoted volunteerism across the nation, fought to make the White House feel public, survived being married to Richard Nixon. And maybe that last one is the real legacy, because surviving a presidency that burned to the ground in real time and doing it with dignity, restraint, and without setting the house on fire yourself is more than most could manage. She didn't want to be remembered. She just wanted to leave intact, and maybe that's the most first lady thing of all. Betty Ford, Gerald Ford, before Michelle spoke openly about anxiety, before Hillary ran for president, before Rosalynn championed mental health, there was Betty Ford, and she said the words no one else would say. She said cancer, she said sex, she said abortion, she said addiction, she said things that first ladies were absolutely not supposed to say. And America didn't quite know what to do with her, because she was funny and open and messy and kind, and most of all, she was human. In a White House that had spent the past decade trying to pretend it wasn't bleeding, Elizabeth Ann Bloomer Ford was never supposed to be First Lady. Hell, she wasn't even supposed to be in Washington. She was a Midwestern dancer trained under Martha Graham with a sharp wit, a practical streak, and a serious thing for jazz piano. She married a man named Gerald Ford in 1948 after her first marriage collapsed. He was tall, clean-cut, loyal, and ambitious in the dependable, kind of boring way. He told her he wanted to be in politics. She didn't know that meant 25 years in Congress, followed by a presidency dropped into his lap after a national constitutional crisis. When Nixon resigned in August 1974, Gerald Ford became president, and Betty, she became First Lady overnight. There was no campaign, no public vetting, no vision rollout, just a woman who'd been planning her retirement, suddenly standing in the White House, smiling like she hadn't just been hit by history. And then she did the most unthinkable thing of all. She told the truth. Just 1 month into her time as First Lady, Betty Ford was diagnosed with breast cancer. And instead of hiding it, she went public. She detailed the diagnosis, the surgery, the mastectomy. She said the words breast and cancer on national television at a time when most women wouldn't even say them at church. And the effect was immediate and seismic. Screening rates for breast cancer skyrocketed. Thousands of women scheduled exams. Letters poured in by the truckload. Because Betty Ford had just done something radical, she made the First Lady's body real. And once the door was open, she never shut up again. After cancer, she talked about equal rights. She publicly supported the ERA, premarital sex. I think young people today are going to do it anyway, so why not be honest? Marijuana. I've smoked it. Didn't inhale. Didn't exhale. Not sure. Abortion. I'm pro-choice. I think every woman should have that right. She said these things in the 1970s, from the East Wing, in full view of America. And the reaction? Some loved her, some hated her, but no one ignored her. The Christian right called her dangerous. Feminists called her a hero. Gerald Ford called her his better half and most trusted advisor. She wasn't trying to be divisive. She just couldn't lie. She once said, "I've always liked to talk. I just never had a microphone before." Now she had the mic, and she wasn't giving it back. Betty Ford was not perfect. She struggled with anxiety, depression, alcohol, and prescription pill addiction. Years before the public ever knew, she lived in constant pain from arthritis, used pills to sleep, wine to cope, and silence to get through the darkest nights. When her husband lost re-election to Jimmy Carter in 1976, she felt relieved and empty. For the first time in decades, there were no cameras, no protocol, no staff to hide the cracks. And the cracks widened until her family staged an intervention. And Betty, in one of the most difficult public pivots in American history, did something extraordinary. She told the country she had a problem, and then she built a place for others to heal too. In 1982, Betty Ford co-founded the Betty Ford Center in California, a treatment facility for substance abuse, recovery, and mental health. She didn't just lend her name, she lent her story. She talked about detox, about relapse, about emotional collapse, and in doing so, she dragged addiction out of the shadows. Her message was simple. There's no shame in healing, only in pretending you don't need it. Celebrities came, politicians came, veterans came, and so did thousands of regular people who finally had a first lady who looked like them, hurt like them, and fought to come back like them. It became her real legacy, not the White House dinners, not the fashion, not the speeches, but the courage to say, "This nearly broke me. Let's help each other not break." Betty Ford is now remembered correctly as one of the most candid, courageous first ladies of all time. But her legacy also includes making women's health a national conversation, destigmatizing mental illness, supporting LGBTQ rights when few others would, advocating for equal pay and protections under the law, creating a space where honesty wasn't optional. It was sacred. She passed away in 2011 at the age of 93, with her hand still wrapped around the work she'd started decades earlier. At her funeral, tributes didn't call her graceful. They called her gutsy, and that's the truth. She wasn't America's sweetheart. She was America's mirror. Cracked, real, and finally brave enough to reflect what was actually there. Rosalynn Carter, Jimmy Carter. If Eleanor Roosevelt blew open the doors for first ladies to engage with policy, Rosalynn Carter walked through with a legal pad and a follow-up question. She didn't host galas. She didn't plan garden parties. She planned legislative strategy. She sat in on cabinet meetings, testified before Congress, co-chaired White House task forces, and still managed the China inventory. Because America wasn't quite ready to give her just one job. She didn't wear flashy outfits. She didn't crack jokes. She wasn't there to make you like her. She was there to make sure someone followed up on the damn memo. Eleanor Rosalynn Smith was born in 1927 in Plains, Georgia, a town so small you could fit it in a campaign bus and still have room for sandwiches. She lost her father to leukemia when she was 13. Her mother became a dressmaker. Rosalynn helped raise her younger siblings. She learned quickly that grief doesn't wait, and work doesn't ask permission. She met Jimmy Carter when she was still in high school. Her best friend's older brother. He was quiet, driven, and already looking for something beyond the peanut fields. They married in 1946, and she quickly discovered she wasn't marrying a farmer. She was marrying a future president, and she decided early that she wasn't going to just watch. She was going to build something alongside him. When Jimmy Carter ran for governor of Georgia, Rosalynn campaigned on her own. She crisscrossed the state, giving speeches, attending forums, and listening, not just to donors or party chairs, but to farmers, nurses, black voters, mothers, mill workers. She took notes, real ones, with names, concerns, numbers, and follow-up actions. When he ran for president in 1976, she did it again, visiting 40 states, making her the most visible campaign spouse in modern history at that time. She didn't just smile from the podium. She explained the platform. Reporters began calling her the other half of the ticket. And they weren't wrong. When Jimmy Carter took office, Rosalynn made history on day one. She became the first lady to have an office in the East Wing and a seat at senior staff meetings in the West Wing. That wasn't ceremonial. She wanted briefings, daily updates, access to experts, lines of accountability, and she got them. She worked as honorary chair of the President's Commission on Mental Health, personally lobbied members of Congress, and was instrumental in passing the Mental Health Systems Act of 1980, a landmark bill aimed at improving community mental health services. This wasn't soft policy, it was federal legislation with real funding and real political risk, and she pushed it through. In 1977, she testified before a Senate subcommittee, the first lady to do so since Eleanor Roosevelt. She wasn't asking for applause. She was tracking the outcome. Rosalynn's core issue was mental health. Years before it was politically safe, socially digestible, or headline-friendly, she talked about depression, addiction, PTSD, and the failure of state hospitals. She visited facilities across the country, asked hard questions, and refused to let care be a slogan. She understood that mental illness wasn't a private failing. It was a public health crisis and a moral obligation. And yet, for all her advocacy, she never made it about herself. Because Rosalynn didn't think being open required being performative. She didn't cry on cue. She didn't broadcast vulnerability. She just showed up over and over until someone handed her the next report. Rosalynn Carter was deeply political, not in the party sense, but in the governance sense. She monitored cabinet morale, managed congressional relationships, acted as Jimmy Carter's closest advisor, especially during the Iran hostage crisis, when the country's nerves were fraying and public confidence was crumbling. She urged him not to run for re-election in 1980. He didn't listen. She campaigned hard anyway. And when he lost to Ronald Reagan, she took it personally. But not because she craved power, because she believed work had been left unfinished. And it haunted her. After 1981, the Carters returned to Plains, Georgia. And instead of cashing in with book deals and cocktail circuits, Rosalynn got back to work. She co-founded the Carter Center in 1982, a nonprofit that would go on to monitor elections, combat global disease, promote peace negotiations, train journalists in responsible mental health reporting. She continued writing books, giving speeches, and advocating for caregiver support, mental health parity, and anti-stigma campaigns. She served on committees, councils, and boards well into her 80s, but she never called herself an activist. She just believed in doing the work. Rosalynn Carter is often described as quiet, but what people really mean is she didn't need to be loud. She understood that leadership could look like planning instead of posturing, listening instead of lecturing, impact instead of iconography. Her legacy includes institutionalizing mental health policy at the federal level, expanding the policy reach of the East Wing, modeling First Ladyhood as full political partnership, setting a precedent for modern working First Ladies, refusing to be either ornamental or invisible. She died in November 2023 at age 96, surrounded by family and survived by decades of quiet revolutions. At her funeral, there were no gilded myths, just truth and wildflowers and people whose lives had gotten measurably better because Rosalynn Carter didn't care whether the camera was rolling. She wasn't there to perform. She was there to go to work. And after the Steel Magnolia retired to Georgia, a starlet moved in, an actress with big hair, bigger pearls, and a hotline to the heavens, a woman who said little in public and whispered plenty in private. Nancy Reagan, Ronald Reagan. There are two stories of Nancy Reagan. The first is soft focus, the loyal wife, the loving partner, the wide-eyed former actress who called her husband Ronnie and held his hand in front of cameras like it was a wedding day on loop. The second is hard lit, the gatekeeper, the image czar, the woman who screened staff, whispered strategies, and ran interference between the leader of the free world and the people paid to run it. Both stories are true, because Nancy Reagan understood something most first ladies before her did not. The presidency is theater, and she was the producer. Born Anne Frances Robbins in 1921, Nancy's childhood was fractured from the start. Her father left when she was young. Her mother, a stage actress, was often on the road. Nancy was raised by an aunt until her mother remarried a neurosurgeon, Dr. Loyal Davis, who eventually adopted her. She took his last name, took his name into Hollywood, and never looked back. She wasn't a star, but she had presence, appearing in more than a dozen films throughout the 1940s and 50s, including Donovan's Brain and Night into Morning. She met Ronald Reagan in 1949 when she asked him, then president of the Screen Actors Guild, to help her get her name cleared from a Hollywood blacklist confusion. He did. Then he called. Then they married in 1952. They had one daughter, Patty, and later adopted a son, Ron. From the beginning, Nancy wasn't just a wife. She was his publicist, his mirror, and his most ruthless protector, and that never changed. As Ronald Reagan moved from acting into politics, first as governor of California, then as a two-time candidate for president, Nancy was there with a notepad and a veto pen, mostly used on people. She had final say on staff, speechwriters, and friends. She knew which suits looked too frumpy, which jokes fell flat, which allies were snakes in smiley ties. By the time Reagan won the presidency in 1980, Nancy had already designed the White House in her mind like a movie set. She wasn't going to redecorate. She was going to reshoot the entire franchise. Out with the Carters' frugality. In with crystal, gold, and shoulder pads. If Jackie was elegance and Betty was honesty, Nancy was image, fully weaponized. One of Nancy's first scandals came with a price tag. Roughly $200,000 in new White House china, funded by private donors but perceived as tone-deaf during a recession. The press pounced, the public bristled. Nancy responded not with apology, but with glamour counter-programming. She leaned harder into designer gowns, Hollywood parties, and photo ops with royalty. She brought back state dinners like they were red carpet premieres, choreographed down to seating charts and flower arrangements. She famously said, "I always dress for the paparazzi. They have the best angles." And she wasn't wrong. Nancy understood that perception was currency, and she made sure the White House looked imperial, polished, and powerful. Even when the economy wobbled, she wasn't trying to be relatable. She was trying to make you believe in the movie. In 1982, Nancy launched what became her signature initiative, the Just Say No anti-drug campaign. It started as a classroom visit. A child asked what to do if offered drugs. Nancy replied, "Just say no." The line stuck, and soon so did the merchandise, posters, PSAs, and televised school visits. It was catchy, ubiquitous, and heavily criticized for being simplistic, moralizing, and ineffective, especially as the administration ramped up punitive drug laws that disproportionately impacted Black communities. But Nancy believed in it. She believed addiction was personal, not political, and that teaching kids to resist temptation was better than building rehab centers after the fact. She didn't win the war on drugs, but she defined its PR strategy for a generation, and she did it in Valentino. The weirdest and most infamous chapter of Nancy Reagan's first ladyship was also her most revealing. In 1981, after Reagan survived an assassination attempt, Nancy grew paranoid about his safety, so she turned to astrology. Seriously, she began consulting astrologer Joan Quigley, who provided advice on when to schedule press events, sign bills, travel, or meet with foreign leaders based on planetary alignments. White House staff didn't know at first. Then they noticed meetings shifting, events rescheduling, security plans restructured, not due to threats, but Mercury retrograde. Eventually, Nancy admitted it, calling astrology a comfort, not a control system. But the headlines didn't care, and neither did her critics. Still, she never apologized for protecting Ronnie in any way she could, even if it meant letting the stars rewrite the schedule. Behind the scenes, Nancy Reagan was brutally effective at White House personnel management. She pushed out Chief of Staff Donald Reagan, who she felt was undermining the president. She helped shape his messaging on Cold War diplomacy, nudging him towards softer language with Gorbachev. She wasn't always right, but she was always heard, and when Reagan began showing early signs of Alzheimer's disease, it was Nancy who managed his public exposure, curated his schedule, and shielded him from embarrassment long before the diagnosis was public. She didn't want power for herself. She wanted to protect the character of her life's script. Ronald Reagan was the star. Nancy was the studio executive, and she was damned good at her job. When Reagan left office in 1989, Nancy retreated quietly. At first, but after his diagnosis in 1994, she emerged as a fierce advocate for Alzheimer's research, raising awareness, funding, and political will for a disease still largely whispered about. She also reconciled with people she'd once warred with, including staff she'd frozen out and children she'd drifted from. Her later years were softer, more human, less Hollywood. She died in 2016 at the age of 94, buried beside her husband at the Reagan Library, in a garden she helped design. Nancy Reagan's legacy is a Rorschach test. To some, she was a controlling elitist obsessed with surface. To others, she was a devoted partner, a style icon, and the power behind the most camera-savvy presidency in American history. She left behind the Just Say No campaign, the modern First Lady media apparatus, a fiercely protective political marriage, a blueprint for image management as policy control. She didn't cook, she didn't sew, she didn't apologize, but she turned First Ladyhood into something closer to a production role in a national performance, and she played her part flawlessly, even when the script got weird. Barbara Bush, George H.W. Bush. If America spent the 80s with its eyes on Hollywood, it entered the 90s with a grandmother who did not care about your approval rating. Barbara Bush was not elegant in the Jackie sense. She wasn't diplomatic like Rosalynn. She didn't radiate charm like Nancy. She radiated something else, authority in house slippers, and she brought that to the White House like she was cleaning out a cluttered attic. With love, with sarcasm, and with zero time for nonsense. Born Barbara Pierce in 1925, she grew up in Rye, New York, the daughter of a publisher and a fiercely traditional family. She met George H.W. Bush at 16 at a Christmas dance. He was a prep school golden boy, already en route to the U.S. Navy. They were engaged before he went to war, married in 1945, had 6 children, moved more than 24 times as George rose through the ranks of business, politics, and eventually diplomacy. She packed and unpacked their life like it was a second job. And in between, she raised sons who would become governors, presidents, and headlines. She survived the death of their 3-year-old daughter, Robin, to leukemia. She held it all together with a spine like rebar wrapped in cotton. Barbara Bush didn't need attention. She needed everyone to eat their breakfast, shut up, and vote. By the time George H.W. Bush became vice president under Reagan, Barbara had already figured out the game. She wasn't trying to impress pundits. She was talking to moms. She gave speeches about literacy, parenting, children's health, and public service. She called herself a housewife who raised a president. And if that sounded smug, it wasn't. It was fact. Reporters who underestimated her got the look. The one that said, "I changed diapers during the Cold War. You think your questions scare me?" She embraced her image as America's grandma white hair. Double pearls, soft sweaters, and then she would roast a senator without changing facial expression. By the time Bush ran for president in 1988, Barbara was a campaign asset. Not because she rallied the youth vote, but because she made middle America feel seen. She was relatable in a way that didn't feel rehearsed. And America liked that. Barbara Bush entered the White House in 1989 with a plan. Stay grounded, stay focused, stay out of trouble. She turned the East Wing into a headquarters for literacy reform, believing that if more people could read, write, and comprehend, we would be much closer to solving so many of our country's problems. She gave speeches, published children's books, established the Barbara Bush Foundation for Family Literacy, and visited schools, shelters, and prisons without fanfare. She did not try to reinvent the First Ladyship. She tried to make it useful. She refused to play political hardball. But when she was asked about her views on feminism, she simply said, "I'm not a feminist. I'm a humanist. I believe in equal rights for all people." When asked what advice she gave her husband, "I don't tell him what to do. I just tell him what I think." And when she hosted the Reagans, the Carters, and the Fords at a state dinner, she smiled and said, 4 first ladies at one table, and not one pair of gloves in sight." Barbara Bush made the First Lady funny again, but she also made her credible. In 1989, Barbara Bush did something quietly radical. She visited a Washington, D.C. home for babies and children with HIV/AIDS, and she picked up a baby on camera, held him, kissed him, talked to the staff, cradled a child that many Americans still believed could transmit the virus through touch. It was a simple, unscripted moment, and it hit the front page. Because in that gesture, Barbara Bush did more to fight HIV stigma than most politicians had done in a decade. She didn't make a speech. She just acted like a decent person on camera. And America noticed. Sometimes the boldest political statement is basic human decency. She understood that better than most. Barbara Bush was the anchor of a political dynasty, one that often threatened to pull itself apart in public. Her son, George W. Bush, struggled with drinking. Her daughter-in-law, Laura, didn't fit the expected mold. Her other son, Jeb, was being quietly groomed for the future. And Barbara, she loved them all. Loudly, but not unconditionally. She once said, "I love my sons, but I don't always like their behavior." She didn't meddle, but she made it clear the name Bush wasn't just a brand. It was an expectation, and when her husband lost re-election to Bill Clinton in 1992, Barbara handled it the way she handled everything, with a raised eyebrow and gritted humor. She left the White House, told the press she was delighted to sleep in her own bed again, and went back to writing, parenting, and giving speeches that always ended with something unexpected, like a pie recipe or a warning. She remained one of the most respected public figures of the era because she didn't beg for respect. She simply expected it, and somehow, it worked. Barbara Bush passed away in 2018 at age 92. Her funeral was attended by presidents, dignitaries, grandkids, and teachers. Everyone had a story. Some remembered her as a loving grandma, others as a fierce advocate for literacy, still others as the woman who once told a drunk senator to sit down and shut up at a dinner party. She was all of those things, and her legacy includes the elevation of literacy as a national issue, the normalization of AIDS compassion and care, the humanization of the First Lady's public role, the creation of a dynasty rooted in duty over glitz. She didn't want to be iconic. She wanted to be respected by her family and useful to her country, and she pulled that off without changing her hairstyle, her beliefs, or her volume. She made First Ladyhood accessible, but never trivial. She once said, "Your success as a family, our success as a nation, depends not on what happens in the White House, but what happens in your house." Maybe so, but when she was in the White House, it felt like someone's mom was finally in charge. But next came the First Lady who refused to sit quietly, the lawyer, the lightning rod, the woman who was ready to be president and almost was. Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, Hillary Diane Rodham. Clinton was not the First Lady with a law degree, but she was the first to use it like a crowbar, prying open the tightly sealed, vaguely ornamental box that First Ladies had been shoved into for 2 centuries. She was brilliant, driven, unapologetic, and blunt. And for every barrier she broke, she was handed 2 new scandals, 3 new nicknames, and a mountain of headlines written in tones that never dared be used for male politicians. She didn't want to be a symbol. She wanted to get things done. So, of course, she became both. And the fallout was national. Hillary grew up in Park Ridge, Illinois, a Chicago suburb with neatly mowed lawns and tightly wound expectations. She was valedictorian, student council president, a Methodist youth leader, and politically precocious. She started as a Goldwater Republican, but by college, Wellesley, she'd become a liberal activist, quoting scripture and Saul Alinsky in the same breath. She gave the first ever commencement speech by a Wellesley graduate, and it went viral, 1969 style. Quoted in Life magazine, rebroadcast on the radio, and clipped by political operatives from coast to coast. Then came Yale Law School, the Children's Defense Fund, the Nixon impeachment inquiry, and then Bill Clinton. She didn't take his name right away, didn't bake cookies, didn't quit her job when he became governor of Arkansas, and it pissed people off. Hillary's been controversial longer than most of her critics have been alive, and she never once pretended to be surprised. When Bill Clinton won the presidency in 1992, he declared that Americans were getting 2 for the price of 1. Cute, terrifying. Hillary entered the White House with her own office in the West Wing, not the traditional East. She hired policy aides, held staff briefings, and made it clear, "I'm not just here to pick out the china." It was radical. It was overdue. And it was immediately framed as a threat. Her first major task as First Lady was leading the task force on national health care reform. A Clinton campaign promised to provide universal health care to all Americans. The result? The Clinton Health Plan, informally known as Hillary Care. It was complex, sweeping, technocratic, ahead of its time, politically toxic. Hillary was called overbearing, secretive, condescending, unfeminine, calculating, and those were the polite columns. The plan failed, spectacularly, but it wasn't the policy that haunted her. It was the tone. America was still not ready for a first lady who wanted power more than pageantry, and Hillary would pay for that ambition every single year that followed. Hillary's time in the White House was a perpetual triage tent for incoming political damage. There was Whitewater, a failed land deal they lost money on; Travelgate, firing the White House travel office staff; Filegate, improper handling of FBI background files; Cattle Futures, turning $1,000 into $100,000 legally, but come on; and of course, Monica Lewinsky. When the affair broke in 1998, Hillary didn't flinch. She backed Bill, appeared on Today calling it a vast right-wing conspiracy, stayed married, held her ground, and refused to play victim. People were confused. Some admired her strength, others resented her coldness, but very few understood what it actually cost her to sit beside a man who had humiliated her in the most public way imaginable, and still smile for the cameras. She wasn't standing by her man. She was standing by the only brand that let her stay in the game. By the time Bill's second term ended, Hillary had already pivoted. She ran for the U.S. Senate in New York and won. She became the first lady in U.S. history to be elected to public office. She served 2 terms, joined the Armed Services Committee, visited war zones, read the entire Patriot Act, did the work. Then she ran for president, then Secretary of State, then president again. But all of that came later. What matters here in the Clinton White House is that Hillary changed what First Lady meant, and she did it with bruises and brilliance and no apology. She didn't soften. She didn't quit. She didn't pretend to be smaller to make people comfortable. And the nation never fully forgave her for that, but they sure as hell learned from it. Hillary Clinton's first ladyship was a firestorm, not warm, not ceremonial, not background music. It was the prototype for a first lady with professional ambition, political fluency, and zero interest in asking permission. Her legacy includes making the First Lady a policymaker, expanding the East Wing's influence on legislation, redefining what political spouses could be, surviving somehow all of it, becoming the first woman to win a major party's presidential nomination. She didn't just break the mold, she reprogrammed the expectations, and in doing so, she became a feminist icon, a political villain, a meme, a symbol, a warning, a weapon, a lesson, a path. First ladies had tried before. Hillary made it possible and paid full price. But after the storm and the spectacle came someone quiet, someone gentle, a librarian who married a goofball and walked into the White House with grace, silence, and the secret power of not needing to be noticed. Laura Bush, George W. Bush. To understand Laura Lane, Welch Bush, you have to understand quiet power. Not silence, not passivity, but the kind of power that doesn't raise its voice because it doesn't have to. She was the librarian who married the class clown, the bookworm who became First Lady during one of the most violent decades in American memory, and the soft-spoken advocate who knew exactly when to speak and when to vanish behind the curtain again. She never upstaged, never lectured, never courted headlines, and still somehow she lasted longer in the public's affection than her husband did. Because in a political marriage often defined by war, gaffes, and protest, Laura Bush was the part that made people believe he might have a soul. Born in 1946 in Midland, Texas, Laura Welch grew up in a modest, conservative household. Her father was a home builder. Her mother taught her to be polite, be thoughtful, and be still. She was an only child, studious, shy, and then at 17, she ran a stop sign in her car. The accident killed a close friend, Michael Douglas, a boy she'd once dated. Laura was never charged. She never spoke publicly about it until decades later, but it followed her, not as a scandal, but as a scar that made everything quieter. After college, she became a teacher, then a librarian. She believed deeply in books, language, and what happens to a child who doesn't learn how to read. She was not political. Then she married a man who never read novels and would later run the world. Laura married George W. Bush in 1977. They were opposites. He was loud, loose, and prone to beer. She was reserved, thoughtful, and visibly uncomfortable with chaos. But somehow, it worked. She helped ground him. He made her laugh. They had twin daughters, Barbara and Jenna, and built a life that was equal parts fraternity reunion and suburban stillness. When George ran for governor of Texas in the 1990s, Laura campaigned only out of obligation. She hated the spotlight. She didn't like interviews. She never wanted to be First Lady. And when George W. Bush ran for president in 2000, Laura was not America's favorite political spouse. That title still belonged to Hillary. But when George took office, after the Florida debacle and Supreme Court drama, Laura found herself holding the teacup in a house divided, trying not to spill a drop. And then came the September event. In that morning, Laura Bush was on Capitol Hill, set to brief Congress on early childhood education. Instead, she watched planes hit buildings and the country fracture in real time. Within hours, she was moved to a secure location. Within days, she was back on TV. Not as a political figure, but as the calm center of a national panic. She spoke softly, urged people to talk to their children, told parents it was okay to cry in front of them, promoted books that explained grief and violence in age-appropriate language. She didn't yell. She didn't demand unity. She simply gave people something to hold on to, and from that moment on, her role changed. She became the emotional surrogate of a wounded country, and she carried that quietly all the way through 2 wars. In the aftermath of the September event, Laura took a surprising turn. She went global. In 2001, she used her radio address, normally reserved for the president, to address the plight of women under the Taliban. It was the first time in history a First Lady had used the weekly presidential radio platform. She didn't posture. She didn't campaign. She talked about girls who couldn't go to school, women beaten for reading, families destroyed by extremism, and suddenly, Americans who didn't know Kabul from Kansas City were listening to a librarian from Texas explain foreign policy through literacy. She traveled to the Middle East, visited Afghan girls' schools, met with refugees, and became one of the Bush administration's most effective diplomatic faces, precisely because she didn't come with a threat or a press team. She came with questions, curiosity, and respect, and the world noticed. Back home, Laura focused her first ladyship on education reform, libraries and literacy, women's health, the National Book Festival, her personal passion project, postpartum depression awareness, teacher support and salary awareness. She launched the Ready to Read, Ready to Learn initiative, visited Title I schools across the country, hosted events for early childhood development researchers. But she didn't give grand speeches. She gave interviews that felt like bedtime stories, soft, deliberate, and aimed at people who'd been shouting for too long. She was, above all else, a stabilizer, and in an administration defined by war, terror alerts, and WMD controversies, Laura Bush was the pause button no one else knew they needed. Laura Bush's strength was in her restraint, but that didn't mean she was passive. She reportedly clashed with Dick Cheney, questioned Karl Rove's tactics, and disagreed privately with her husband on everything from same-sex marriage to stem cell research. But she never aired it publicly. She didn't believe in performative rebellion. She believed in influence over theater. Even when her twin daughters made headlines for underage drinking and rebellious college antics, Laura handled it with a mix of grit and grace, reminding reporters that they're 19 and they're mine. She was the one in the family who understood consequences, and she knew how to survive them. Laura Bush left the White House in 2009 with approval ratings higher than nearly everyone else in the administration, including her husband, and she didn't cash in. She continued to promote global women's education through the George W. Bush Institute. She championed conservation, literacy, and maternal health. She gave quiet speeches, published a surprisingly moving memoir, spoken from the heart, and watched from the sidelines as her husband's presidency was reevaluated in history's rearview mirror. She rarely commented on politics, but when she did, it mattered. She criticized family separation policies at the border, supported same-sex marriage before it was mainstream, and defended the power of books in a world going digital. Because Laura Bush knew something that others forgot. A book is a mirror, and sometimes people don't like what they see. Laura Bush never wanted to be First Lady, but she did it better than most who did. Her legacy includes elevating education and literacy to national importance, humanizing foreign policy through quiet diplomacy, reframing First Ladyhood as a role of stewardship, not spectacle, surviving political firestorms without raising her voice. She was never loud, never trendy, never divisive, and still she left a deeper imprint than almost anyone realized at the time. She didn't need the last word, she just needed the right one. And then, after the librarian left, the spotlight swung back to a woman who had already been there before, but this time she wasn't trying to balance power, she was trying to win it. Michelle Obama, Barack Obama. She was the first black first lady, but before that she was Michelle LaVaughn Robinson. Southside Chicago, working class grit, Princeton educated, Harvard law tough, and completely uninterested in anyone's idea of how she should shrink. She married a man who wanted to change the country. She never thought that meant she would have to help hold it together. Michelle Obama didn't just enter the White House. She stormed into the cultural bloodstream. She was icon and target, role model and Rorschach, champion of health food, dignity, decency, and don't you dare touch my daughters. And in 8 years, she redefined what it meant to be both visible and vulnerable, and what it cost. Michelle was born in 1964 in a one-bedroom apartment on the second floor of a bungalow in the South Shore neighborhood of Chicago. Her father, Fraser Robinson, worked for the city, never missed a day, even while battling multiple sclerosis. Her mother, Marion, raised Michelle and her brother with precision, patience, and an encyclopedic memory for side-eye. Michelle shared a room with her brother, studied like a machine, and spent her weekends at libraries, not malls. She skipped second grade, went to Whitney Young, a magnet high school, then Princeton University, where she was one of the few black students, then Harvard Law, where she learned to code switch while arguing constitutional law. She was a black woman at the pinnacle of white institutions, and she made it look easy, even when it was quietly killing her self-confidence. Then came Barrack, the intern, the overconfident, underpaid community organizer who talked in loops and walked like he had nowhere to be but owned the street anyway. She didn't fall for him immediately, but eventually she mentored him, dated him, and, against all internal warnings, married him. She wasn't looking to become first lady. She just wanted student loans paid off, kids raised strong, and one uninterrupted night of sleep. Spoiler, she didn't get any of that. Michelle hated politics. She said it often, and she said it loudly, even as her husband's star rose in the Illinois State Senate, then the U.S. Senate, and eventually the 2008 presidential race. Her job? Humanize him, protect their daughters, try not to get turned into a stereotype or a soundbite. That last one, total failure. She was called angry, uppity, militant, overbearing, Barack's baby mama, and this was before the primaries ended. So she did something smart. She pivoted, softened the language, leaned into stories about family, parenting, and middle-class life, wore cardigans on daytime talk shows, did not hide her intelligence, just reframed it. By the time Barrack won, Michelle had gone from radical wife to America's mom and the most admired woman in the country. But don't get it twisted. She didn't change. She calibrated. Michelle Obama entered the White House with 2 children, a law degree, and no interest in playing Stepford. Her goals were keep her daughters normal, protect her marriage, avoid headlines, get something real done. And she did, all 4. She focused her platform on childhood obesity, launching the Let's Move initiative. It involved healthier school lunches, physical activity campaigns, celebrity partnerships, garden building at the White House, a full-scale war on vending machines in public schools. She got food lobbyists mad, got Republicans to mock her as the school lunch lady-in-chief, got kids to plant kale. She didn't care if you liked her. She cared if your kid could run a mile without wheezing. That was her style. Michelle was never afraid of being serious. She just wrapped it in charm. And when she spoke, people listened. Michelle Obama was also the first lady of viral speeches, best-selling books, fashion magazine covers, high approval ratings, far higher than Barack's, the most successful first lady memoir in history, Becoming, Tears, Fury, Joy, Beyonce, eye rolls, and gifts. She was a walking contradiction, the most powerful woman in America, with no official role, expected to be decorative but accused of being domineering, celebrated for speeches but roasted for vacations, fiercely black, but constantly asked to represent a post-racial fantasy. She once said, "I wake up every day in a house built by slaves." People gasped, others clapped. Some wrote op-eds. She didn't back down. She was the first lady in history who wasn't allowed to be invisible and refused to be reduced. She danced with Ellen. She read books to kids. She hugged veterans. She worked out on Instagram. She gave speeches that eclipsed her husband's, and still she was asked if she wanted to run for president. Her answer? Nope, not happening, not ever, because Michelle Obama didn't want more power. She just wanted to leave power better than she found it. Michelle Obama left the White House in 2017. Shoulders squared, voice steady, and popularity intact. Her legacy includes normalizing working motherhood at the highest level, defining first ladyhood as culture shaping, not just ceremonial, owning a platform without pretending it wasn't exhausting to hold, showing young girls, especially black girls, that they could be loud, soft, brilliant, stylish, and unshakable all at once. She didn't smile through everything, but she smiled on her terms, and that, more than any initiative, was the real revolution. And when she stepped down, the spotlight moved again to a former model, a quiet figure, a woman fluent in 5 languages, fluent in silence, and married to a man who rarely was. Melania Trump, Donald Trump. If Michelle Obama was the storm, Melania Trump was the glass lake after the hurricane. Beautiful, opaque, and absolutely not interested in telling you what was underneath. She was the first foreign-born first lady in nearly 200 years, the first to have posed nude, the first to marry a man who rode down a golden escalator and announced his candidacy like a Bond villain with a Twitter account. And through it all, she said almost nothing. No one knew what she was thinking. And that made her both fascinating and infuriating, because Melania didn't try to be the next Michelle, or Laura, or Hillary, or anyone. She was a silent spectacle, a symbol no one could agree on, standing beside a man the country couldn't stop watching. Born Melania Knobs in 1970 in what was then communist Yugoslavia, she grew up in a modest apartment in Sevnica, the daughter of a car dealer and a pattern maker. She was raised in a system that prized discipline, quiet, and national loyalty. By the time she was a teenager, she'd already begun modeling in Ljubljana, eventually adapting her name to Melania Knaus for international appeal. She studied architecture and design briefly, but the runway won out. She worked across Europe, Paris, Milan, and eventually moved to New York in the 1990s, and that's where she met Donald J. Trump, real estate mogul, tabloid regular, and divorced father of 4. They began dating in 1998, married in 2005. Their wedding guest list included Bill and Hillary Clinton. Their honeymoon was a Time cover story waiting to age poorly. And when Trump won the presidency in 2016, Melania became first lady of a nation more polarized than ever before. She never said she wanted the job. And for the first few months, she literally didn't show up for it. Unlike every modern first lady before her, Melania did not move into the White House immediately. She stayed in New York with their son, Barron, for nearly 5 months, citing his school schedule. The press speculated. Was it rebellion? Was it caution? Was it negotiation? No one knew, and Melania never told them. Eventually, she moved into the East Wing, redesigned her spaces, hired a chief of staff, and launched Be Best, an initiative aimed at children's well-being, anti-bullying, and online behavior. The irony? Her husband was the most prolific online bully in American political history. When asked about that, she said, "I don't always agree with everything he tweets." It was the closest thing she gave to criticism, and it echoed like a scream in a marble hallway, because Melania's power wasn't in what she said. It was in what she refused to say. Melania Trump didn't speak much, but her clothes shouted. Hard. There was the white cowboy hat during a tense press conference, giving full West Wing villain with diplomatic immunity. Zara jacket that said, "I really don't care, do you?" worn en route to a migrant child detention center. Pussy bow blouse worn just after the excess Hollywood tape leaked. Colonial safari outfit during an Africa trip that sparked international backlash. And the constant strategic use of neutral tones and heavy sunglasses, perfect for disappearing in plain sight. Was it a protest? A strategy? An accident? She never explained. And that was the magic, or the menace, of her entire tenure. She created a vacuum and let the country argue inside of it. There were glimpses, just glimpses, that Melania wasn't entirely on board. She swatted Trump's hand away on camera, twice. Maybe 3 times. She refused to do joint interviews, stuck to solo appearances, insisted on protecting Barron's privacy. A rare, unified success even among critics. When January 6th happened, she didn't speak out immediately. When she did, she condemned the violence and the media coverage of her flower arrangements in the same breath. Her staff leaked stories of being ignored. Emails showed her trying to plan nonpartisan campaigns, then being sidelined. She wasn't a revolutionary, but maybe she was something more haunting, a decorative conscience trapped in a theater she didn't script, refusing to clap. Be Best was mocked mercilessly. The name, the grammar, the vagueness. But Melania stuck with it, quietly visiting schools, hospitals, and shelters. She advocated for opioid awareness, met with kids on military bases, read stories in libraries. No big speeches, no sweeping legislation, just quiet gestures that barely made the news. And maybe that's what she wanted. She once told an interviewer, "I'm the most bullied person in the world." Was it self-pity? Projection? An unspoken burn? No one knew, because with Melania, the story was always written in invisible ink. Melania Trump left the White House in 2021 the way she entered it, dressed impeccably, smiling slightly, not answering questions. She didn't attend Dr. Jill Biden's tea ceremony, the traditional transition between first ladies. She didn't give speeches, didn't write a memoir, didn't rebrand. She simply disappeared. Her legacy is strange, hard to summarize, and deeply divisive. She is remembered for her immigrant story, which she never politicized, her marriage to the most chaotic president in modern history, her fashion diplomacy and PR disasters, her emotional opacity, and her commitment to not caring what people thought or pretending she did. Melania Trump was not a transformational first lady, but she was an era's perfect symbol. Beautiful, controlled, withheld, watched, projected upon, and ultimately still unknown. She didn't reshape the East Wing. She just refused to speak its language. And maybe that, in the end, was her statement. But when she left, something old came back. Soft warmth, open laughter, a teacher's voice, and a first lady who never wanted the spotlight, but never blinked when it landed. And that lady, she will come back as the first lady once again. Jill Biden, Joe Biden. There's something disarmingly radical about a first lady who still shows up to her day job. Dr. Jill Biden isn't pretending to be above the chaos. She just refuses to let it eat her life. She's not glamorizing the East Wing. She's grading community college essays in it. She isn't throwing policy grenades. She's writing syllabus notes in pencil and reminding America softly that the country doesn't just need leaders, it needs teachers. And she would know. She's been both. Born Jill Jacobs in 1951 in Hamilton, New Jersey, she grew up in the suburban swirl of 1950s America. Cheerleader, waitress, eldest of 5 sisters. She went to college while working part-time, got her first degree from the University of Delaware, and later earned 2 master's degrees and a doctorate in education. She got married young, divorced early, met Joe Biden on a blind date in 1975, just a few years after he lost his first wife and baby daughter in a car crash. He had 2 little boys. She wasn't sure, but after a while, she said yes, not just to Joe, but to the whole life package. And for decades, she was never just a politician's wife. She was a mom, a professor, a runner, a volunteer, and she stayed that way. Even when the cameras showed up, Jill Biden has never craved the spotlight. Not in the 80s Senate campaigns, not when Joe ran for president in 1988, flame out, 2008, me, or 2020, chaos. She hates the stage, prefers small rooms, speaks like a teacher even when she's giving stump speeches. But she was always there, watching her husband's back, holding grieving families, hosting National Guard moms, rolling her eyes when the moment required it, and a few times when it didn't. During the 2020 campaign, she famously shoved a protester off stage when they rushed her husband. No security team, no hesitation, just Jill in pearls and pumps, ready to tackle. Because when she believes in something, she shows up. And when the country voted Joe into office, Jill Biden became First Lady and didn't quit her job. Jill Biden is the first lady in American history to hold a full-time job while in the White House. Let that land. She teaches English at Northern Virginia Community College, just outside D.C. Her students call her Dr. B. She grades papers on Air Force One, writes lesson plans in hotel rooms, leaves sticky notes on drafts between diplomatic dinners. She says teaching isn't what I do, it's who I am. And she meant it. Even when critics called her title pretentious, even when op-eds mocked her doctorate, even when no one understood why someone with Secret Service protection wanted to teach freshman comp at 8 a.m., she kept going because she believes in community colleges the way some people believe in scripture. And she believes dignity starts with education. That's the thread of her entire public life. Jill Biden doesn't do culture wars. She does classrooms, military families, and cancer research. She focuses on community college funding, military spouses and caregivers, joining forces, childhood mental health, cancer research and patient support in honor of Beau Biden, public service encouragement, teachers not being treated like floor mats. She travels constantly, solo and with Joe, to schools, bases, small towns, and clinics. No entourages, no headlines, just work and hugs, and probably a handout with MLA formatting tips. She once said, "Teaching isn't just a job to me, it's a calling. Like being a doctor or a nurse or a police officer or a firefighter. That's not a metaphor, it's a worldview." She sees America as a place that needs nurturing, not branding. And she's doing her part with dry erase markers and empathy. Jill Biden isn't a policy maven, but she's not apolitical. She's fiercely protective of Joe, sometimes to a fault. She's pushed back against critics, corrected his slips, smacked down hecklers with the smile of a kindergarten teacher about to call your mother. She's sharply strategic, especially about image. She chose bright colors and florals for the 2021 inauguration to signal hope. She wears designers who champion education causes. She even made her Christmas decorations a national Rorschach test for vibes and subtlety. But she never lectures, never overreaches, never forgets the optics of humility. Even in heels, she's a study in contrasts. First lady and full-time faculty, steady and fierce, private and everywhere, wife and public interpreter. And that balance has helped steady an administration that began under the weight of insurrection, inflation, and infinite noise. She didn't try to fix all that, she just kept showing up. Dr. Jill Biden is still here, still working, still building a legacy in lesson plans, not legislation. But already we can say she's normalized first ladies with outside careers, reinforced education as a core national value, elevated military family support and caregiver visibility, modeled grace under extreme political pressure, offered the public an image of power that doesn't perform, it persists. She will likely never run for office. She doesn't want fame. She just wants the kids to pass the test and get home safe. And somehow, in this moment, that might be exactly what America needs.